Chapter 206. At the back of the market there was a duel arena that wasn't too big, but it wasn't too small either. Unlike other cities, the mercenaries here were a loose alliance made up of countless tightly knit groups. Because no one was willing to submit to another, any conflict that arose between them would often lead to bloodshed. The mercenary association's power was limited, and they weren't in a superior and subordinate relationship with the mercenaries. At most, they were like referees. As for the mercenaries, if they could still control their emotions, they would treat you like a referee. If you really didn't care, the referee would still cut you down without hesitation. In order to control the bloodshed to a certain extent, the Mercenary Association built this duel arena. It was normal for two people to challenge each other to a duel because they didn't like each other. Especially for mercenaries, it was a common occurrence. The Mercenary Association's public stance was that they wouldn't support or stop it, but in reality, they encouraged the mercenaries to resolve their conflicts in the arena. At least it was better than killing each other in secret. However, this also varied from person to person. For example, Gibran wouldn't stand in such a ridiculous duel arena. There were quite a few people sitting around the duel arena. They were all there to watch the show. When they saw Dwight Steele, Winston, Gibran, and the others walking over together, they tactfully made way for them. They were a bit late, and the show had just begun. The duel arena's platform wasn't small, at least a few hundred square meters. It was big enough for a magician and a warrior to have a fair duel. At this moment, 20 slaves slowly climbed onto the platform. They were divided into two groups. They wore very little clothing. Regardless of gender, they were all wearing short, coarse battle skirts that revealed their smooth or rough thighs. The men were naked on top, while the women had an extra section of tube top. The only decent thing on the slaves was the headband on their heads. The style of the headband was very beautiful, exuding a soft luster under the sun. It seemed to be inlaid with gemstones, but it was too far away, so it was hard to see clearly. A magician in a white robe slowly walked onto the platform. He first cast a spell to amplify the sound, and then gave a speech. His main idea was to introduce the origin of the slaves, and he also used all kinds of beautiful words to praise the slaves' strength, beauty, and loyalty. At the end of the speech, a few attendants carried a batch of long swords and iron shields onto the platform. Under the command of the magician, the silent slaves walked forward and chose their own weapons. Winston was stunned as he exchanged glances with Dwight Steele and the others. They all thought of the same thing. It was a game that was loved by the nobles a long time ago, live gladiators. Those attendants carried a few buckets of water to the platform and unceremoniously splashed the water on the slaves. The water had color. The slaves of one camp turned red, while the slaves of the other camp turned blue. Begin. A voice filled with excitement echoed in the air above the dueling ground through the sound amplification spell. The slaves still stood there silently and did not move. The magician retreated to the side of the platform and took out an hourglass from his space ring. He placed it on the ground and loudly said, "Time's up. If there are any survivors on either side, it will be decided that both sides have lost." Hearing this, the slaves finally became a little more energetic. They looked at each other and also observed their opponent. No one knew who made the first move, but then the situation suddenly intensified. The slaves of the two camps shouted and collided with each other. Without any dazzling do-chi, the slaves completely relied on their own physical strength to fight. They should be warriors who had been on the battlefield for a long time. Even the few women were the same. Their movements were simple, powerful, and swift. This made the battle very cruel. Blood blossomed one after another. Broken arms and legs flew everywhere. If they were stabbed by a long sword or chopped down, the scene would be better. However, some of the slaves were smashed by iron shields and their brains burst open. That scene was really horrifying. In just a short time, the winner and loser had been decided. One camp only had one slave left, while the other camp had 4. The slave waved his sword and iron shield, blocking left and right. There were many injuries on his body, and the situation was very critical. Suddenly, he let out a roar, and his body emitted the light of combat chi. The 4 slaves who were besieging him were shocked and hurriedly retreated. The slave did not chase after them. His body suddenly stiffened, and then his roar turned into a scream. The long sword and iron shield fell down from his hands, and then he involuntarily fell to the ground. He held his head with both hands and desperately rolled, but after rolling a few times, he no longer moved. Below the platform there was silence. People came to watch the show, but they did not expect to see a bloody battle. Although the mercenaries did not dislike fighting, they should at least find a reason to fight. For example, in order to survive, in order to solve a threat. Even Gibran, who was criticized by others, would not kill for fun. To be precise, it was not that they did not like blood, but they could not stand this unreasonable cruelty. The magician in the white robe stood up and announced the end of the first battle. More than a dozen attendants ran up the platform to clean up the corpses, and the 4 surviving slaves helped each other to walk down the platform. When they walked past the magician, he suddenly reached out and stopped them. Among the remaining slaves, there were 3 men and a woman. The 3 men were only slightly injured, but the woman's injury was more serious. She had been stabbed in the leg, but she could barely walk with the help of her companions. However, her left arm had been smashed by the iron shield. The bone should have been shattered, and it was twisted in a very strange posture. The magician knocked the female slave's left arm a few times with his magic staff, then took 2 steps back and waved his hand. One of the attendants pulled out a long sword and slashed at the female slave's neck. The movement of the sword was not fast. Just now, Han Jin and the others had seen clearly that the female slave was very powerful. She had knocked down 4 opponents one after another and laid the foundation for the victory of the whole camp. Logically speaking, she should have been able to avoid the sword, but she just stood there blankly and let the blade cut through her neck. Blood splashed out and a head flew up. The headless body swayed and fell to the ground. The 3 male slaves were stunned for a moment, then slowly turned around and walked down the platform. These bastards! Do they still have any humanity? Morrison said angrily. So cruel! Sunir's mood also became very bad. Do you know what the totem of Cold Shadow City is? Majordomo Gale said calmly. Only then did everyone see that Gale had already grabbed Yelena's arm. Yelena tried to shake him off, but it was as if Gale's hand had grown roots. She couldn't get rid of him at all. Yelena, stop messing around, Han Jin said softly. Yelena seemed a little discouraged. She rolled her eyes at Han Jin and gave up struggling. Majordomo Gale, what did you say the totem of Cold Shadow City is? Han Jin asked. It's the snow wolf. Gale's eyes flashed, as if he was recalling something. Only those who have been to the snowy highlands know how scary the snow wolf is, and understand what the people of Cold Shadow City believe in. I think they're doing this on purpose, Winston said with a frown. While they were talking, the second batch of gladiators had already stepped onto the platform. This time, the people who stepped onto the stage were a little strange. On one side, they were all women wearing gauze dresses that barely covered their last bit of shame. The curves of their bodies and the 2 bright red spots on their chests were faintly discernible. They were all around 16 or 17 years old, and the weapons in their hands were even more outrageous. There were mops and fire sticks, all of which were commonly used at home. On the other side, there was only a giant man about 2 meters tall. He held a steel longsword in his hand, wore soft armor, and wore a helmet in addition to a headband. Was this a gladiator battle? Begin. The magician put the hourglass back in place. The dozen or so girls huddled together. They didn't even have the courage to look at their opponent, let alone fight. The mops and fire sticks in their hands were shaking violently, and some of them were even crying. Time slowly passed, and the giant man kept looking up at the sky, not moving or speaking. The referee was a little impatient and had to repeat the rules loudly. However, the giant man still didn't move, as if he didn't hear anything. Seeing that the situation was a little awkward, the magician felt very embarrassed. He whispered a spell, and the headband on the giant man's head suddenly shone brightly. The giant man's body swayed slightly, and then he looked down with a sneer on his face. Then, he put the long sword across his neck and slashed it hard. A fountain of blood gushed out, and the giant man stumbled forward a few steps before falling down on the platform with a plop. The audience was silent for a moment, and suddenly someone shouted, "Good! That's more like a man." The crowd had been holding back for a long time, and this shout lit the fuse. The unruly mercenaries all exploded, and wave after wave of shouts resounded through the sky. They were free, and they worshipped freedom. They would never allow anyone or any force to dictate their fate, not even the gods. Therefore, seeing the miserable end of the slaves made them angry from the bottom of their hearts. Of course, the mercenaries were also swayed by benefits, but they had their own principles. For example, they had to pay for their meals, and they had to pay for their women. No matter how strong they were, they couldn't kill people for no reason. These were the most basic rules of respect for the lives of their own kind. Isolated Cliff City had never participated in any wars. This lord fell, and another lord rose, and it had nothing to do with them. Their relatively peaceful lives made them unwilling to bow down to power and violence. In other words, the more blatant the power, the more ferocious the violence, the fiercer their resistance. The smarter mercenaries had already noticed that something was wrong. The magicians of Cold Shadow City seemed to have other intentions, and they were deliberately scaring the crowd. Most of the mercenaries just felt that the warriors had died unjustly, and the girls were pitiful. The giant man was unwilling to kill his own kind, and would rather end his own life. He was a good man. But no matter what, it was enough to make the mercenaries angry. The former was not a threat from outside forces, but the latter made them feel sympathy. "You bastard of Cold Shadow City, I want to fight you! Motherf *Ker, you don't even treat us as human beings." The mercenaries' roars came one after another. Morrison's couldn't hold it in any longer, and he yelled at the top of his lungs, "Go! Brothers, kill those bastards!" Han Jin didn't say anything, and he didn't dare to make any moves, but shouting a few times wasn't a problem. The people nearby heard the yelling and turned around. When they saw that it was Morrison's, they became even more motivated. Morrison's was surrounded by important figures in the mercenary world, so if he dared to yell like that, he naturally had their support. The magicians of Cold Shadow City near the platform immediately panicked. They never thought that it would cause a riot. In fact, when they passed by Depew City and Holy Crown City, they did the same thing, but in those two cities they only received silence. Compared to isolated Cliff City, the difference was too great. Chapter 207. A magician in his 60s, who was also wearing a white robe, could no longer sit still. He hurriedly said to the person beside him, "Master Juventus, what do you think?" The person in charge of coordinating with the Cold Shadow City caravan today was the vice president of the Mercenary Association, Juventus. Seeing this scene, he showed a hesitant expression. As the saying went, it was difficult to offend the public, and his power was limited. To put it bluntly, he could tell the mercenaries what they couldn't do, but he had no right to tell them what to do. There were only a few rules in the Mercenary Association, and the mercenaries all knew that. They weren't breaking any rules, and were just expressing their dissatisfaction with the foreign merchants. Even if he went up, he wouldn't be able to do anything. Seeing that Juventus was silent, the old magician couldn't help but snort coldly. He took out a magic scroll from his space ring and threw it out. As the magic waves spread out, a row of black dots appeared in the sky. The black dots grew bigger and bigger until they covered the sky above the arena like a dark cloud. The old magician's face showed a proud expression. This was the gargoyle army of Cold Shadow City, and also the pride of Cold Shadow City. In the final battle against the Cumin City, this army played a pivotal role. In fact, many cities had a rapid response army, such as Wild Willow City's Silver Pegasus, Zagun's Vampires, and the Gargoyle Army, but they all had their own unique characteristics. The Silver Pegasus Army's Pegasus was a variant of the Snowstrider beast. They had a pair of fleshy wings and could fly for short distances. Within a certain distance, the Silver Pegasus Army's movement speed was extremely fast, and could come and go like lightning. Coupled with the cooperation of the elven archers, their attack power was very fierce. However, their defense was weak. If the opponent had enough troops, the Silver Pegasus army would often suffer heavy losses. Vampires also had their own strength. After they transformed, they could fly for hundreds of miles without rest, and could even join the battle directly. Their combat power was also stronger than that of the Silver Pegasus army. Strong referred to the fact that they were not afraid of any special forces. Whether it was facing a swordsman's camp, a knight's regiment, or a group of magicians, they had the ability to fight to the death. Tenacity referred to their endurance. They could fly hundreds of miles and then fight for an entire day without being exhausted. The vampires had unimaginable physical strength. If it had been the Silver Pegasus Legion, they would have collapsed long ago. In terms of individual combat power, the gargoyles were the weakest, but they still had the ability to look down on everyone else. The scariest thing about them was that the gargoyles weren't living beings. In other words, they were created by the magicians of Cold Shadow City, and Cold Shadow City's biggest advantage was that they could fight a war of attrition. The sky was filled with gargoyles, while the ground was filled with stone golems and steel golems. Even if the entire army was wiped out, it wouldn't matter. Before the enemy could even catch their breath, more gargoyles and steel golems would press forward. Of course, Cold Shadow City needed enough magic materials, and that was the main reason why they showed up in isolated Cliff City. Now that they had finally opened the exit to the icefield, their leaders were planning for an even bigger war. The Silver Pegasus Legion and the vampires couldn't do it. If they used up too much of their resources, they would need years or even decades to recover. Wild Willow City was currently in an awkward situation because their Silver Pegasus Legion had suffered heavy losses in the war more than 10 years ago, and had yet to recover. Seeing the horde of gargoyles appear, Juventus' expression changed slightly. "Hogan, what is the meaning of this?" "Nothing," Hogan calmly replied. "Since you can't protect us, we can only rely on ourselves to protect ourselves." Juventus was furious, but he barely managed to control his emotions. He coldly said, "It seems that there is no point for me to stay here." With that, he stood up and left his seat. Hogan didn't ask him to stay. He believed that he had the ability to deal with any changes. Juventus took 2 steps, then stepped back and said to Hogan in a mocking tone, "Before I leave, I want to tell you 2 things. First, you are stupid. Second, you are even more stupid than I thought." "You?" Hogan was also angry. He coldly said to Juventus, "Master Juventus, I hope you will remember what you said today. You are still in the mood to question my memory?" Juventus laughed. Hogan's gaze turned to the field. He realized that there was a subtle change in the field. The mercenaries were originally sitting in their respective seats, but now they were in a mess. However, that wasn't true chaos. The mercenaries were in groups of a few or a dozen, forming independent teams. There was order amidst the chaos, and no one was panicking. On the contrary, they all looked high-spirited and excited. In fact, their attitude was fundamentally wrong. Most mercenaries were troublemakers. If they just followed their orders, nothing would happen. If Hogan had just let his subordinates push the slaves onto the stage and let the mercenaries choose, those who felt that their team lacked battle partners and wanted to find a beautiful woman wouldn't be stingy with their money. As for whether they would be treated as a partner or cannon fodder, a female slave or a wife, it all depended on the person. However, if the cannon fodder was brave and loyal, and the female slave was gentle and considerate, things would naturally change. A person who was used to a free environment wouldn't allow their conscience and judgment to be influenced by pressure. In other words, mercenaries liked to follow their feelings. It could only be said that this strong performance was like shooting oneself in the foot. Master Raphael, what do you think of the magicians from Cold Shadow City? Dwight Steele asked softly. I hate them, Han Jean slowly replied. He had to say this. Sunir had been holding his hand tightly, as if she thought of him as a bad person and wanted to crush his hand. Han Jean wanted to say that he hated them, but he understood that just hate wouldn't satisfy Sunir. Dwight Steele and Winston looked at each other. Winston pondered for a moment, then turned to Gibran. We should set an example for everyone. Gibran, what do you think? You mean we should do it? We should at least teach them a lesson. I have no problem with that. Gibran smiled coldly. In fact, he and Han Jean were the same kind of people. Julia was standing right next to him, so even if there was a problem, he would still pull out his sword and kill them. Han Jean and the others began to move, slowly walking down the stairs. The mercenaries had been paying close attention to their movements, and when they saw that Han Jean and the others had the intention of showing up, they became even more agitated. Dwight Steele, Winston, Gibran, and Han Jean. If the four of them had shown up separately, the impact wouldn't have been as great as it was now. Whether they admitted it or not, the mercenaries all thought that they were the top powerhouses in the mercenary world and were the pride of the mercenaries. With the four of them together, it was equivalent to a huge wind vane. In fact, the situation in isolated Cliff City had already been broken by Han Jean. In the past, everyone made their own money and didn't ask for a good relationship with each other, only that there were no conflicts. Even if there were conflicts, they had to find a way to resolve them. They were just independent groups and never had a common goal. Han Jean and Yelena had joined forces to kill many mercenaries who were plotting against them and became famous overnight figures. Moreover, Han Jean also had the identity of a dragon slayer, so no one dared to look down on him. With Dwight Steele and Winston as the representatives, many mercenary groups were trying to get closer to Han Jean. Even the Mercenary Association had lowered their stance. Although this wasn't a common goal, it was at least a common idea. The key point wasn't the difference between goals and ideas, but the word common. Seeing the newcomers, Hogan couldn't help but show a serious expression. He wanted to ask Juventus about it, but Juventus had already ignored him after scolding him. At this moment, Juventus had already walked up to greet them. First, he nodded at Dwight Steele and the others. They were old acquaintances, so there was no need for formalities, but he didn't dare to be careless in front of Han Jean. Master Raphael, what have you been busy with these days? I haven't seen you come out yet. Juventus smiled. I have some new ideas. I need time to think, so I can only stay at home every day. Han Jean also smiled. At this time, Hogan also braced himself and walked up to greet them. As a magician born and raised in Cold Shadow City, he had received a different set of inheritances, so he didn't know much about the outside world, nor did he care to learn about it. Now that he saw so many powerhouses suddenly walk out, his heart sank. Although 10th grade powerhouses couldn't be said to be unrivaled, they couldn't be underestimated. Dismark's famous Bloody Knight, Gerald, was only at the peak of the 10th grade. Discounting Dwight Steele and Winston, just the Red Vanguards alone, Gibran was a 10th grade thief, Kane was a 9th grade great magician, and Julia and Edwina were both 10th grade rangers. There was no need for them to make a move. Just standing there quietly was enough to make Hogan tremble in fear. Han Jean walked up to the platform. He was being forced to do something beyond his ability. Sunir had been looking at him with a fanatical and trusting gaze, as if he could save the people if he wanted to. If he didn't do anything, he would disappoint Sunir. Moreover, he also felt that the slaves were very pitiful. Looking at the giant's corpse, Han Jean sighed softly, then said loudly, This is a true warrior. He would rather die than wield a butcher's knife on a weak woman. Brothers, come up and carry his body down. He is qualified to receive a grand funeral. I'll do it. I'm willing to serve Master Raphael. Following these words, a few mercenaries scrambled up to the platform. Wait. The referee stopped the mercenaries unhappily. He was our slave when he was alive, and even if he's dead, his body is still ours. What are you trying to do? May I ask, how did they become slaves? Han Jin asked calmly. They were all warriors of the Common City. We defeated them, so naturally they became our slaves. At the mention of defeating the Common City, the referee's face turned arrogant, and he glanced at Han Jin from the corner of his eyes. That simple? I understand, Han Jin smiled. If I defeat you, you'll become my slave, right? Chapter 208. The referee was a little surprised as he looked at Han Jin from head to toe. If he was challenged by any of the experts below the stage, he definitely wouldn't have dared to answer, but the young man in front of him didn't seem to have anything special other than a pretty face. What, do you want to refuse? Han Jin said calmly as he pointed at the female slaves huddled together on the stage. Do they have the right to refuse? If they don't, you won't either. The mercenaries below the stage started cheering. Master Raphael, kill him! Kill him! This was a battle maniac who wouldn't be satisfied without seeing blood. Coward who doesn't dare to accept the challenge, go back. Don't embarrass yourself here. This person was a little smart and knew how to goad Abel. Master Raphael, it's all up to you. Don't let us down. This was a typical brainless person. As soon as he said that, he was mocked by his companions. What? Do you think Master Raphael will lose? Although isolated Cliff City didn't have a strong defense, nor did it have powerful magic crystal cannons, the people here weren't easy to bully. Even if the entire army of Cold Shadow City came, the mercenaries would not submit to anyone's tyranny. Of course, if there was someone who could win their approval, that would be a different story. However, this was not submission, but support. There were only a few mercenaries who came to watch the show. Many mercenaries were not interested in the slave caravan. If they had the time, they would rather go to the bar to drink and brag. Otherwise, they would hug the barmaid and run upstairs to have some fun. It was much more comfortable than watching a performance in the ice and snow. They knew that there were female slaves in the caravan, but they didn't want to build their own nest, nor did they want to worry about them. To put it bluntly, if they spent a lot of money to buy a female slave and run off to the Terasha Mountains in spring, if they were unlucky and killed by a magical beast, who knew who would benefit from the female slave? There was no need. Isolated Cliff City didn't lack women anyway. However, the gargoyles circling in the air attracted the attention of the mercenaries. There were many gargoyles, and it was obvious that they were an army of foreign forces. Countless mercenaries, including those who were drinking, strolling, and sleeping in, were swarming towards the arena from all directions with weapons in hand. Seeing that the mercenaries were getting more and more agitated, and that a large number of mercenaries were pouring into the arena, Hogan's face became even gloomier. Coincidentally, the referee turned his head and used his gaze to ask for Hogan's opinion. Hogan nodded slightly and made a few gestures. Hogan believed that only a grand victory could calm the mercenaries down. He also told his men to capture the guy alive and turn him into a slave. It could be seen that although the guy did not have any basic magic waves and did not look like a warrior, he was definitely a big shot among the mercenaries. Turning him into a slave would give them the right to negotiate. I, 8th Order Sage Prio, accept your challenge. The referee bowed slightly and revealed a mischievous smile. However, he still maintained sufficient politeness in his speech. The mercenaries below the stage were stunned for a moment before they suddenly booed. An 8th Order Sage? That's not enough. If that guy was a great sorcerer or even a top-level magus, this battle would definitely be exciting. But an 8th Order Sage? Lord Raphael could probably kill him with just a finger. Prio heard the boos and subconsciously thought that the mercenaries were laughing at him for bullying the weak. Therefore, he thought himself clever and explained, "You were the one who initiated the challenge, weren't you?" Han Jin did not speak and only looked at Prio quietly. He was too lazy to say anything more. Prio took out a magic staff from his spatial ring and secretly guessed Han Jin's profession while chanting a spell in a low voice. With a wave of magic waves, Prio's skin suddenly became rough, and then clusters of shining scales appeared on his body. Dragon Scale was a spell of the 8th grade. Although the scales made of elemental elements could not be compared to real dragon scales, it still provided the caster with an extremely strong defense. However, the Dragon Scale spell had a considerable negative effect, which made it very difficult for the caster to move. Therefore, the Dragon Scale spell's usefulness was greatly reduced. Only in a one-on-one battle where the opponent was certain to not release any magic would the Dragon Scale spell be able to display its power. Wow! Dragon Scale. TSK. Don't forget the magic shield. Iron Skin, hurry up and use Iron Skin. Stupid pig, what can I say about you? Divine Earth Shield, hurry up, or you won't have a chance. Perhaps it was because they thought that Han Jin could defeat his opponent with a single blow, so the mercenaries unanimously supported Prio. On the stage, Han Jin did not know whether to laugh or cry. Just a moment ago, he was still the center of attention, but now it was as if he had been abandoned by everyone. Poor Prio misunderstood once again. If a lion met a small ant, it could just slap it with its claws. It was too ridiculous to wear heavy armor to protect himself. Prio originally wanted to continue casting the magic shield, but the cries of the mercenaries made him change his mind. He smiled at Han Jin and said, "You may begin." At this moment, a clear voice came from below the stage. "Raphael, teach them an unforgettable lesson." It was Sunir's voice. The louder the cries of the mercenaries, the more excited she became. She had to dig her nails into her palms to keep herself calm. Of course, this was only on the surface. She was in the arena and felt the atmosphere around her. She knew very well what kind of image Han Jin had in the hearts of the mercenaries. This was her greatest pride. Han Jin had been very calm since he went on stage, but when he heard Sunir's cries, he suddenly smiled. In terms of appearance, Han Jin was slightly inferior to Hollister, who relied on his looks to attract bees and butterflies. His hair was black, but not as warm as Hollister's blonde hair. His eyes were also black, but not as charming as Hollister's ocean blue eyes. However, when it came to temperament, Hollister couldn't catch up to Han Jin no matter how hard he tried. Han Jin's smile, which came from the bottom of his heart, was as bright as the sun and as gentle as water. Coupled with his pure and otherworldly aura, it was far better than Hollister's pretense of weariness. The women were charmed by Hollister and would try to drag him to bed. However, if they were charmed by Han Jin, they didn't even know if they had the courage to approach him. This was because Han Jin gave off an otherworldly aura that made them feel ashamed of their inferiority. Han Jin then bowed in Sunir's direction and smiled. "Yes, ma'am." Whoosh. The mercenaries went into an uproar again. Whistles could be heard all over the place. This was a huge piece of gossip. Sunir couldn't help but feel embarrassed. Bad guy. He must be doing this on purpose. The intense gazes of the mercenaries in front and behind her almost made her unable to raise her head. However, she didn't want to embarrass Han Jin, so she could only force herself to calm down. Her eyes, which were countless times more intense than the mercenaries, were fixed on Han Jin. Prio also noticed Sunir at this time. It was said that women were the most charming when they were in love. This saying was true. Although Sunir was just as beautiful in the past, her temperament was slightly more immature. How could she compare to the radiant beauty she was now? Prio's eyes lit up and he slowly said to Han Jin, "Let's make a bet. If you win, I'll be your slave. If I win, that elf will be mine." You don't have the right, and you don't have the chance to become my slave. Han Jin's eyes suddenly turned cold. Did you just say that we can start? While Pryo was still thinking about the hidden meaning in Han Jin's words, Han Jin had already moved. Quiet as a virgin, moving as a rabbit, could be used to describe normal warriors, but it wasn't appropriate to use it to describe Han Jin. The first half of the sentence was fine, but the second half was the key. Han Jin was definitely not related to a rabbit. He was thunder, a raging tide, an unstoppable force, a king who looked down on all directions. At the very least, this stage belonged to him alone. A green light shot out from Han Jin's hand, and then it quickly turned into a giant sword, a sword that was more than 20 meters long. This was an indescribable aura. From the moment the giant sword took shape, it dominated the entire area, turning everyone into dumbstruck. Even their hearts stopped beating. In the next moment, the giant sword was already flying towards Pryo. To be more precise, it was swatting at Pryo as if he were swatting a fly. There was a loud bang, and a sound wave that was invisible to the naked eye spread out in all directions, testing the ears of the mercenaries. Dwight Steele and the others who were relatively close to the stage frowned. It was obvious that they were also affected. Sand and stones flew everywhere, and dust rose up to a height of dozens of meters. The ground trembled violently, and some of the weaker mercenaries couldn't help but sway. After a moment, the dust slowly settled, revealing Han Jin's figure. His figure was still as pure and otherworldly as ever, and his expression was calm, as if the attack just now had nothing to do with him. As for Pryo, he had completely disappeared, leaving behind only a few bloodstains that needed to be carefully identified. On the spacious stage, there was a ditch that was more than 10 meters long and 5 or 6 meters deep. The edges of the ditch were neat and smooth, and it almost completely cut the stage in half. This was a specially made dueling ground that could at least withstand the trampling of a warrior or the attacks of a magician. However, in front of Han Jin's flying sword, it was no better than tofu. Han Jin's gaze fell on the female slaves. Pryo had completely angered him, and in his eyes, there was only one person left in the world, and that person had to die. The female slaves were the closest to him, so they were the most affected. At this moment, they were all lying on the ground in disarray. Han Jin could clearly see blood seeping out of their mouths and noses. Clearly, they had suffered serious internal injuries. However, Han Jin didn't have time to think about anything else. He could only make up for it later. Right now, it wasn't over yet. Who's next? Han Jin's extremely calm gaze fell on Hogan. You or them? Han Jin stretched out his hand and pointed. Following his gesture, the flying sword that was quietly floating above Han Jin raised its tip and pointed at the large group of gargoyles in the sky. This was one of the gargoyles' strengths. If they were intelligent creatures, they would have scrambled to get out of the way after witnessing this scene. However, the gargoyles continued to hover in the air, as if they were not afraid of the flying sword at all. Dwight Steele and Juventus looked at each other, and both could see the joy in each other's eyes. No matter who was in charge of who, or who was restricting who, the mercenaries were still on their side. The powerful Han Jin was, of course, their pillar of support. Before, they had only heard rumors, so it was inevitable that they had some doubts in their hearts. Now that they had seen Han Jin's power with their own eyes, their doubts disappeared. That's right, they had a dragon slayer. Only then did the surrounding mercenaries react. One by one, they began to shout crazily. Their shouts gathered together to form a huge tsunami that resounded throughout the city. Hogan's face was ashen. He had thought that the young man was just a big shot with status, but no strength. In the end, the young man's strength was far beyond his imagination. Moreover, the mercenaries' shouts became more and more orderly. Raphael and Dragon Slayer, these two shouts resonated with each other. No matter how stupid he was, he understood the young man's identity. Fight a dragon slayer? He really didn't have the courage. Han Jin raised his hand, and the mercenaries' shouts gradually weakened. You want to refuse? Han Jin sneered. His gaze swept across the ice magicians. I already said that none of you have the right to refuse my challenge. This was the first time he had fought since refining Mantico's longsword. With his ability, he could only refine a mid-grade flying sword, but the attack power of a flying sword was far beyond his imagination. Of course, the key consumption was also far beyond his imagination. He only had enough energy left to launch one attack, but he was confident that he could defeat the old magician with one attack. Moreover, he had not only refined one flying sword during this time. As for the rest, it would be up to Gibran and the others to shine. Old man, go! The mercenaries began to clamor again. Be smart. Don't be like that stupid pig and use all your magic, haha, please. Han Jin politely stepped aside. He felt that the gargoyles seemed to be under the old magician's control, so he had already decided on his next target. Whether the old magician accepted the challenge or not, he would still attack. Feeling the scornful, mocking gazes, as well as the fear and nervousness of the magicians under him, Hogan had no choice but to slowly walk up the platform. However, his footsteps were very heavy, and each step was like a tall mountain. He had to use all his strength just to take one step. After walking for a long time, the mercenaries finally lost their patience and began to hiss. Only then did he stand in front of Han Jin. You have enough time to prepare, Han Jin said calmly. Looking at Han Jin, Hogan couldn't help but cough. He didn't want to die. In some areas they were at the forefront of the entire continent. For example, the headbands that controlled slaves, and the various magic puppets. However, it was this that determined the common characteristic of the magicians in Cold Shadow City. They always controlled the puppets to attack the enemy's formation, and rarely participated in real battles themselves. Hogan wasn't the only one who was afraid of death. Most of the magicians in Cold Shadow City were afraid of death, but the funny thing was, this didn't stop them from ignoring the lives of others. You better hurry up. My patience is limited, Han Jin said coldly when he saw that Hogan still hadn't released any magic. Hogan couldn't help but look up at the gargoyles in the air, then at the mercenaries around him. More and more mercenaries had gathered, and their numbers were even greater than a large group of gargoyles. Could the gargoyles really fight against a dragon slayer and so many mercenaries? Han Jin flicked his finger, and the huge flying sword made a crisp, buzzing sound. He was reminding Hogan to hurry up. Hogan's body trembled violently, then he did something that shocked everyone. He threw his magic staff to the ground and said with a trembling voice, I surrender. Chapter 209. Surrender. Han Jin smiled faintly, glanced at Hogan, and then turned his gaze to the sky, where a large group of gargoyles was still circling. Sasu was not only a magician but also a bard. From the bottom of his heart, he preferred the latter. Ever since he was very young, he had developed a strong interest in all kinds of stories. Magnificent legends and dangerous adventures would make people addicted to them and unable to extricate themselves. He worshipped those heroes who left behind magnificent poems and fantasized that he could become one of them. Even if it was just a supporting role, he would be satisfied. It was a pity that Sasu did not see this scene, otherwise, he might be even more excited than Sunir. While walking with the girl and chatting casually, the girl suddenly ran to the side of the road, picked up a handful of snow, and rubbed it hard on her face. What are you doing? Sasu asked in surprise. If mother sees the wound on my face, she will be heartbroken. The young girl rubbed her face even harder. However, the weather was already very cold, and the young girl was wearing very little. Her face was already red from the cold, and now she was using ice and snow to rub her face. She really could bear to do it, but looking at her grimacing face, it was obviously not a good feeling. Then the girl ran back, pointed at her face and asked seriously, Can you still see it now? Sasu looked at her carefully. There were 5 black fingerprints on the girl's face, and it was obvious from the bright red on her cheeks. Before Sasu could speak, the girl suddenly saw the bruises on her arm. She screamed, turned around, and ran back to rub her arm with snow. "Bad guy, damn it," the girl murmured as she rubbed. She chose to silently endure the violence, but this did not mean that she did not hate Roland. It was just that for various reasons, she did not dare to show it. Sasu suddenly remembered that he had the recovery scroll, which was made by Yelena and the other deacons. He quickly waved his hand and said, "Don't bother. Come here, I have a way." The girl stood up doubtfully, blowing hot air into her palms as she walked toward Sasu. Her hands were as red as her face from the cold. Sasu threw out the scroll, and a white light appeared out of nowhere and hit the girl. The girl suddenly screamed. No, Sasu was startled, but the scroll had already taken effect, so he could not take it back. "What's wrong?" "I don't have money," the girl said timidly. Sasu did not know whether to laugh or cry. "I'm not asking you for money. What are you afraid of?" "You don't want money?" A hint of vigilance appeared in the girl's eyes. She quietly retreated a little and crossed her arms in front of her chest. This sense of vigilance was unnecessary and somewhat hurtful, but it wasn't without reason. Ever since her family became poor, some people had helped her, but they all had similar intentions. Dauncey, who had beaten her up today, was a classic example. She would rather die than submit, so Dauncey had changed his mind and was always looking for opportunities to make things difficult for her. The dangerous environment made her mature early. She thought that she had seen through the world, and that there must be a return for a sacrifice. Because of this, she subconsciously classified Sasu as one of those people. As a matter of fact, the girl lived at the bottom of society and only came in contact with some people with little power. Her understanding was too one-sided. Not everyone would be stingy when the things she paid were insignificant, and not everyone would take a fancy to her beauty, at least not Cessation. Sunir and Yelena were both peerless beauties, and so were Julia and Edwina. Although he would not have much interaction with them, he had seen enough of them to have a higher standard. Ordinary women could not move him at all. In fact, this was also a kind of misfortune. Which outstanding woman did not have a bunch of competitors around her? Sasua's future marriage was destined to be a difficult struggle. Sasu shrugged. "Hurry up and go. Our captain is still waiting for me." He saw the change in the girl's expression and decided to make things clear. "Our captain asked me to send you off, so you don't have to worry." "Oh," the girl replied softly. Then, she remembered something. "You have to be careful. Dauncey's uncle is not a good person." "Him?" Sasu sneered. "He dares." "Is your captain very powerful?" the girl asked tentatively. "In this isolated cliff city, there shouldn't be anyone more powerful than him." Sasu smiled. He dared to say this because he was full of confidence in Han Jin. When he first met Han Jin, what kind of strength did Han Jin have? What kind of strength did Han Jin have now? He believed that his words would come true. **T. The girl shook her head. "How could your captain be more powerful than Master Dwight Steele and Master Winston?" "You know Dwight Steele and Winston." "Of course I know them. Who in isolated Cliff City doesn't know them? Do you know who came out to help you today?" The girl blinked her big eyes. She didn't understand what cessation meant. In the end, one of them was Dwight Steele, and the other was Winston. The young girl was ashamed and ashamed. She rarely boasted, nor did she have the chance to boast. Today, she finally had the chance to improvise, but she was exposed on the spot. That feeling! She wished she could drill into the snow and never come out again. "Haha, let's go." Sasu smiled. The girl's words were noticeably quieter. After walking for about half an hour, she pointed at a large courtyard in front of them and said softly, "That's my home." Sasu was surprised. From the girl's clothes, she must be very poor, But that courtyard was not something a poor family should have. That's your home? Yes. Why don't you sell the courtyard and then? Sorry, I don't mean anything by it, it's just that. I understand, the girl said in a low voice. The girl said in a low voice, it's Mommy who doesn't want to sell it. Mommy said that Daddy grew up here, and Daddy's shadow is everywhere. Also, Mommy never believed that Daddy had really left us. She always said that Daddy would come back sooner or later. If we really sold the yard, Daddy wouldn't be able to find us. Your dad is a mercenary? Yes. The girl nodded slightly. You men all like to lie, right? What? What do you mean? Sasu couldn't help but smile bitterly. Dad was so good to me, but he also lied to me. He said that he was going to take one last mission to save money for my dowry, but he... The girl couldn't finish her sentence, and 2 streams of tears flowed out of her eyes. Sasu sighed softly. The last mission was very inauspicious. Of course, there were unique reasons for it. If a mercenary who was about to retire could still be tempted by a mission, then the rewards of the mission would be huge, but the danger would also be very high. It also determined that the death rate would be ridiculously high. An image flashed across Sasua's mind. In a bar, an old mercenary with weathered hair promised, "Okay, this is my last mission." Under normal circumstances, most of the people who said this would never come back. The girl had already walked to the door. She turned back and said, "You, come in and have a drink. I don't have anything else to entertain you at home. I hope you won't laugh at me." No. Sasu was just about to refuse when he suddenly realized that something was wrong. There were many messy footprints in the snow near the door, and the footprints were very big. The girl said that only she and her mother lived here. Whose footprints were these? The door was suddenly pushed open, and Cromwell's figure appeared in the door. He grabbed the girl's hair and dragged her in. Sasu was furious. He never dreamed that Cromwell would be so bold, even to the point of madness. He actually dared to make a move on the girl. Just then, 2 figures appeared beside him, and a shiny dagger was placed on his neck, one from the front and one from the back. "Kid, don't move." Sasua's body stiffened. He was here to send someone off, and wasn't prepared for battle at all. This was a mage's Achilles heel, and also an unavoidable one, because a person couldn't live in a state of tension forever. Moreover, the 2 bandits were of a higher grade than Sasu. It was too easy for them to subdue the unprepared Sasu. Cromwell sneered. The 2 bandits pushed Sasu into the door, and a few mercenaries from the Mercenary Association closed the door tightly. The girl was still struggling and screaming. Cromwell was annoyed and kicked the girl's lower abdomen. The girl's originally bright red cheeks suddenly turned pale, and her body shrank to the ground bit by bit. Her small mouth opened wide, but no sound came out. Cromwell grabbed the girl's hair again and dragged her into the main hall. Dauncey and a few mercenaries were sitting inside, and a white-haired old lady was squatting weakly in the corner. Seeing the girl being dragged into the hall, the old lady suddenly charged over with strength she didn't know she had. "Let go of my daughter! What are you doing?" From the moment the girl's figure appeared, Dauncey had been staring at her with a venomous gaze. The old lady's cries finally ignited his anger. He stood up abruptly, picked up the stool he was sitting on, and smashed it at the back of the old lady's head. This wasn't the main street, and he could do whatever he wanted. Besides, they were here to kill, so what did he have to worry about? With a bang, the old lady was already sick. How could she withstand it? She was knocked unconscious on the spot, but Dauncey had no intention of letting go. Instead, he picked up the stool even more viciously and smashed it down. Bam bam! In just a few hits, the old lady's head had been split open, and blood gushed out and covered the ground. "Mother!" The girl jumped up as if she had been electrocuted. Her hair was disheveled, and she bared her fangs and brandished her claws like a lunatic as she pounced forward. Dauncey revealed a sinister smile and swung the stool back at the girl. A frightening sound of impact rang out as the stool landed heavily on the girl's chest. The girl's entire body swayed and spun for a while before she fell to the ground on all fours, blood flowing out of her nose and mouth. Mother! Mother! The girl used all her strength to flip herself over and struggled to crawl toward the old lady. Tie her up and gag her. Don't let her scream, Cromwell said coldly. Seeing this scene, Sassu trembled with anger. He gritted his teeth and said word by word, "Are you still human?" "Ha ha!" Cromwell laughed but didn't say anything. At that moment, the door to the hall was pushed open again, and a mercenary rushed in. "Sir, bad news!" "What?" Cromwell was stunned. "In the sky, there are a lot of gargoyles in the sky. They seem to be heading toward the arena," the mercenary said while panting. "All the mercenaries in the city are rushing over with weapons." "Sir, Cromwell pondered for a moment. "Sir Juventus is in the arena, so he should be fine. Besides, isn't it good for us to have everyone's attention attracted?" After saying that, Cromwell's gaze turned to Sassu, sizing him up with interest. "Kid, aren't you going to introduce yourself?" Sassua's face was ashen, and he only looked at Cromwell coldly. "I won't waste words with you," Cromwell said slowly. "Tell me, where did that girl run off to?" "What girl?" "Don't look for trouble." Cromwell's face darkened. "I'm talking about that girl. The one who claims to be the heir to Morgan and Company." Sassu was stunned, but he quickly sorted out some things. In fact, Sassu was a smart person, but he didn't show his intelligence when he was always with Han Jin and the others. "So, you've been looking for us," Sassu said coldly. "It's good that you understand. I wonder what you're interested in. Is it that girl? Or the seal of the heir?" "Both of them." Cromwell laughed. "I've answered what I should. Now it's your turn to answer my question. Where is Miss Cheeley now?" Today, he had been humiliated so badly that he had no face left. Coupled with the mission he was shouldering, he had enough reasons to settle the score with Han Jin, both publicly and privately. It was fate. If he hadn't walked on that street, he wouldn't have met his nephew. At this moment, he was already helping Ewing maintain order in the duel arena. When he saw Han Jin show his prowess, only he knew how much courage he would have to carry out the mission. Unfortunately, he had walked on the same street as Han Jin. A year ago, Morrison's and the others were just ordinary mercenaries. According to common sense, it was impossible for there to be any great changes in a year. Therefore, although there were some doubts in his heart, Cromwell still made a self-righteous conclusion. These little guys only met Gibran and the others by chance. This was also the reason why he could maintain his confidence and speak with a condescending attitude. Sassu was silent, thinking about countermeasures in his mind. "Kid, there's no need to throw your life away for others. If you tell me the whereabouts of Miss Keeley, I'll let you go at once, and I'll keep your secret. You'll still be friends with them when you go back. No one will know what you've done. Do you understand?" Cromwell guided him earnestly. "I'll give you time to think about it carefully." Sassu remained silent. He didn't want to anger Cromwell and wanted to stall for time. Cromwell also remained silent. He wasn't in a hurry. He believed that he had enough patience, and Sassu wouldn't be able to escape from his grasp. After some time, Dauncey couldn't take it anymore and whispered something into Cromwell's ear. Cromwell's eyes darted around before he nodded with a smile. Dauncey chuckled strangely and bent down to pick up the tightly bound girl. He placed her on the table and began to caress and pinch her. Seeing that the girl couldn't make a sound, he felt a little unsatisfied and tossed the ball of cloth to the ground. The girl stared blankly at the ceiling. In fact, she couldn't feel Dauncey's hand at all because her mind was on the verge of collapse. She didn't make a sound when Dauncey pulled the ball of cloth out. She only murmured, "Mother, Mother." Dauncey reached out and grabbed the girl's breasts through her thin clothes. He suddenly twisted, causing the girl to cry out in pain. As long as you can react, hee. Dauncey laughed even more proudly. Kid, let me tell you a secret. This nephew of mine, not only does he like women, he also likes men. Do you understand? Cromwell said with a smile. Dauncey paused for a moment, but he immediately understood what his uncle meant. He purposely put on a greedy expression and looked at Sassu from head to toe, as if he was about to pounce on him. Sassu couldn't help but feel a chill run down his spine. At this moment, a loud boom was heard, and the ground trembled slightly. This hall hadn't been repaired for a long time, and the dust on the ceiling rolled down to the ground. Cromwell was shocked. What's going on? The people in the hall looked at each other in confusion. A moment later, a tsunami of shouts sounded. You two, go out and see what's going on, Cromwell ordered. Cromwell ordered, and then his eyes fell on Cessation. Boy, haven't you made a decision yet? Let me tell you, my patience is limited. Actually, Sassu stuttered. He was trying his best to buy time. If he didn't return, Han Jin would definitely be suspicious. The key was how long it would take for Han Jin to be alerted, and how long it would take for Han Jin to find this place. What is it? Cromwell perked up. I hope you can give me a little more time to think about it carefully. Cromwell hesitated for a moment, then nodded. All right. I hope you won't disappoint me, or else, hee. Dauncey wanted to finish the deed as soon as possible, but when he saw the look in his uncle's eyes, he knew what he had to do. While laughing lecherously, he stretched out his hand and twisted the girl's body, causing her to scream continuously in pain and agitating cessation. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 210. Han Jin lifted the magic staff with the tip of his foot, while Hogan bent over, his eyes flickering. He was afraid of death, so he chose to surrender, but that didn't mean he didn't have the strength to fight back. Before he was killed, he could at least give the order to the gargoyles to destroy everything. The mercenaries gradually quieted down. Dwight Steele, Juventus, and the others all stared at Han Jin, their expressions somewhat nervous. Offending the emissary of Cold Shadow City would definitely lead to bad consequences, but the army of Cold Shadow City was too far away to pose a threat to them for the time being. The gargoyles in the sky were right in front of them, and that was the most important thing. Of course, the gargoyles alone wouldn't be able to change the situation in isolated Cliff City, but casualties were inevitable. At this moment, a sudden and anxious voice rang out, Sir! Sir! They've caught Sassu, hurry up and go. Chipango had just arrived. He had followed Han Jin and Gibran's orders, and had been secretly following Cromwell. Later, he saw Cromwell find a few helpers and break into a house. Not long after, he saw Sassu and the girl approaching, and only then did he realize something was wrong. When Sassu was subdued, he rushed back as fast as he could. Although Chipango wanted to make a contribution and leave a good impression on Han Jin, he was also someone who knew the severity of the situation. There were some things that could be taken risk. If you won, you'd win everyone's respect, and if you lost, you'd just die. However, there were some things that needed to be taken seriously. If something happened to Sassu, the responsibility wasn't something he could bear. However, there were mercenaries everywhere around the arena, and Chipango couldn't squeeze in no matter how hard he tried. He couldn't even get close to Gibran and the others, let alone the platform or Han Jin. In the end, he could only use his last resort, which was to use his voice to attract Han Jin's attention. What? Han Jin was stunned. My lord, Cromwell and his gang have caught Sassu. Chipango couldn't care less now. He shouted as he squeezed forward. A strange thing happened. Just now, he was desperately trying to squeeze forward. He even wanted to take out his dagger and stab someone, but the few brothers in front of him didn't move at all. Now that he shouted a few times, there was a commotion in the crowd. They actually automatically opened up a narrow path. There were even people helping him to maintain order. Move, move. Han Jin had now become the center of attention. His every move would attract countless people's attention. Those who could talk to Han Jin were naturally his friends or subordinate. People's attitude towards him had changed a lot. Han Jin took a deep breath and looked at Hogan. "You are very lucky," he said faintly. Hogan appeared to be even more humble, and his back bent even lower. "From today onwards, you're going to live with another identity. Are you ready?" "I understand, my lord." "No, master." Han Jin sneered. He didn't believe in Hogan's loyalty, but he really didn't have time to do anything. Saving Sassu was the most important thing. "Then do you know what you should do now?" Hogan smiled flatteringly. He only dared to raise his head when he saw that Han Jin really needed him. With a wave of magic, the circling gargoyles spread their wings and flew away from the arena. "Lord Juventus, Lord Dwight Steele, and Winston, I'll need you guys to deal with things here." Han Jin's figure flashed, leaving Hogan behind and appearing at the edge of the platform. "Raphael, do you need help?" Winston hurriedly asked. "No need. Gibran and I are enough." "Lord Raphael, I'll go with you." Juventus' face was a bit stiff. The joy from before had long disappeared. In fact, he was just as angry as Han Jin. The situation around them was getting more and more turbulent. The infiltration of Lord Forza in Fado City, the warning of Grand Duke Solomon in the capital of elements, and the emergence of Cold Shadow City all made people feel uneasy. No one could guarantee that isolated Cliff City could continue to maintain its neutral and detached status in the future. The upper echelons of the Chamber of Commerce and the Mercenary Association had been thinking about the direction of the city. Under such circumstances, a powerful dragon slayer had appeared among the mercenaries. How gratifying was this! If they had known this would happen, they would have directly expelled Lord Force's messenger from the city. Juventus' mission was to mend the rift between the two sides. The Chamber of Commerce and the Mercenary Association had been highly consistent in this matter, and had also promised Juventus that they would do their best to satisfy all his need. Unfortunately, Han Jin had been avoiding visitors ever since he returned to the city. Including today, Juventus and Han Jin had only met a total of 3 times. He couldn't be too enthusiastic, or it would have the opposite effect. Bringing gifts to visit or sending money and beauties, these methods were too childish. What the upper echelons needed was to establish a true friendship with a powerful dragon slayer. In other words, they needed Han Jin to develop feelings for the city, not some hypocritical game. After a few contacts, Juventus became more and more confident in his mission. Although he had great strength at a young age, Han Jin's attitude was very gentle, without the slightest bit of arrogance. It was the easiest to interact with such a person. There was no need to scheme or think too much. As long as there was enough sincerity, it was enough. Not to mention the meaning behind it, Juventus also liked to interact with such a young man. Now that he heard that Cromwell had captured Han Jin's people, it was no less than a blow to his head. Perhaps all his previous efforts would be in vain. Thinking of this, Juventus gritted his teeth in anger. A commotion came from the street. The mercenary was startled. He carefully opened the courtyard door and poked his head out to see a row of figures rushing over from the distance. He couldn't help but be shocked. He closed the courtyard door behind him and rushed to the hall. His hand had just touched the door when he suddenly felt a cold wind behind him. He turned around suspiciously, but there was nothing. In the hall, Dauncey kept laughing lewdly as he tore at the girl's clothes bit by bit. Sassu felt a wave of sorrow in his heart. It was clear that it wasn't the girl who had implicated him, but he who had implicated her. Cromwell wanted to know Chi Li's whereabouts. Even if today's incident hadn't happened, Cromwell would still come looking for them. "All right, I'll tell you." Sassu had already made up his mind. Oh! Cromwell's face lit up with joy. He had been running around for over a year for this mission, and today, he could finally get a result. Just then, the door to the hall was pushed open, and a mercenary hurriedly ran in. "Sir, there are many mercenaries rushing over here." "What? Are you sure they're coming for us?" Cromwell's brain spun rapidly, but he couldn't figure out what had gone wrong. I don't know. Anyway, those mercenaries are running along the street toward us. Bastard! Come back and tell me when you understand. The mercenary didn't dare to make a sound. He looked at his companions, who were all surrounding the girl, touching and poking her for fun. He couldn't help but feel dejected, and walked out with his head lowered. The mercenary came to the courtyard gate again, wanting to quietly open the gate to observe the situation outside. Who would have thought that as soon as he opened the gate a crack, he would see an extremely beautiful girl standing more than 20 meters away, holding a frighteningly large magic staff in her hand. Then, a dazzling white light shot straight at his face. No! The mercenary could only utter one word before he and the door were shattered by the powerful lightning. Yelena swung the magic staff in her hand, and another lightning ball shot out, hitting the door of the hall. The people in the hall reacted quickly. A thief hurriedly reached out to grab Sassu, but suddenly saw a flash of white light. His hand left his upper arm without warning and fell down. His bleeding arm hit Sassu, but he couldn't make any threatening movements. The thief let out a scream, and the dagger in his right hand stabbed to the side with all his strength. With a clang, the two daggers collided, bursting into countless dazzling sparks. Gibran's figure was completely revealed. His dagger pressed and flicked briskly, slashing toward the thief's finger at a speed faster than lightning. As the saying went, the shorter the distance, the more dangerous the fight. The battle between thieves had always been extremely dangerous. Gibran used his dagger to slash the thief's finger, and the thief could also attack him in the same way. Sure enough, the thief was desperate and didn't retreat at all. The dagger in his hand went straight for Gibran's wrist. Unfortunately, Gibran attacked first, and his movements were a little faster than the thief's, but this little bit was enough. Blood splattered, and the thief's 4 fingers that were holding the dagger were cut off neatly, and a blood groove appeared on Gibran's wrist. Leger's figure appeared behind another thief, and he waved his dagger toward the back of the thief's neck. The thief immediately reacted. His body dodged to the side, and his dagger stabbed behind him. At the same time, blood spurted out from his neck, and a blood line appeared behind him. Both the attacker and the attacker were injured. "You're courting death." The thief let out an angry roar and pounced toward Leger, but he was just bluffing. He turned around and rushed in the opposite direction at an even faster speed. He was very rational. In the case of a sudden attack, the most important thing to do was to control the hostage, not defeat the opponent. However, he never thought that his companion would be defeated so quickly. The outcome was decided in almost an instant. Gibran took a step forward and blocked Sassu. The dagger in his hand drew an afterimage in the air and stabbed toward the thief's chest. The thief had no choice but to use all his strength to meet Gibran's attack. With a crisp sound, the two daggers collided. The thief didn't have time to change his move when he suddenly felt a pain in his back. Leger had already closed in and stabbed his dagger deep into the thief's back. The thief's eyes widened. Gibran's lips curled into a contemptuous smile. With a flash of his dagger, the thief's throat was cut open. The mercenaries around the round table reacted slower, but they still managed to react. They all reached out to grab the girl. As for Dauncey, he was a meaningless existence. He was still foolishly unbuttoning his pants. At that moment, a hand reached out from the ground and slapped the bottom of the table. The round table instantly disintegrated, and the girl and the table flew into the air and hit the ceiling. The mercenaries didn't manage to grab anything, and their hands froze in place. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. Calm, there are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 211. Before the mercenaries could react, Han Jin had already risen from the ground and slapped a mercenary in the chest. His movements were very light, as if he was playing a game with someone, but the leather armor on the mercenary's back was instantly shattered into countless pieces. His whole body was also sent flying, hitting the wall, and then softly falling down like a puddle of mud. The mercenaries were shocked and reached for their swords at the same time. Han Jin swung his right fist from bottom to top, hitting a mercenary's jaw. Spirit possession seemed very similar to effect magic, but in fact there was a huge gap between them. For example, a magician with very strong spiritual power could indeed increase the power of a small fireball, but the effect was very limited. At the very least, the magician would not be able to use a small fireball to defeat a professional of the same level. In another world, self-cultivators often used their whole life to practice one kind of Taoist magic. Spirit possession was also an independent magic. No one was stupid. If there was no room for improvement, self-cultivators would have already found another way. After breaking through the gate, Han Jin's spirit possession was greatly improved. Moreover, its speed, strength, and other aspects were all improved. The mercenary's jaw was thrown high in a strange position, but the back of his head was tilted down, almost touching his back. Then his body swayed a few times and fell down. His neck had been crushed by the twisting force. Even if he was still alive, he could no longer control his body. Another mercenary pulled out his long sword, roared, and stabbed at Han Jin's chest. Han Jin casually waved his left arm and blocked the long sword. With a ripping sound, Han Jin's left arm was fine, but the long sword cut a big hole in the sleeve of his robe. Han Jin's eyes turned cold. Without waiting for the mercenary to withdraw his sword, he rushed forward at an unimaginable speed, waving his fist and punching the mercenary's chest. When the mercenary flew out, he was still chasing after him, one punch after another, bombarding the mercenary's body. The hall was very spacious, but it was too small for someone who was in the middle of a fight. The mercenary was knocked against the wall and suffered several heavy punches from Han Jin. His body was close to death, but Han Jin didn't let him go. He slapped his palm on the mercenary's deformed chest. With a loud bang, a 2-foot-wide hole appeared in the wall. The mercenary was sent flying into the distance along with countless flying bricks and stones. He didn't stop until he hit the wall of the courtyard. Bang! The young girl and the round table fell to the ground. The whole battle took a very short time. The young girl flew up and fell down. Only a few seconds had passed, but Han Jin had already killed 3 people, and his methods were very fierce. The remaining 2 mercenaries were scared out of their wits. They desperately rushed toward the young girl. They had lost all their courage, and only wanted to take control of the hostage and then escape from here. A black light shot out from Han Jin's palm and hit the round table. The young girl on the table suddenly slid away, sticking to the stone floor until she reached the other end of the hall. The 2 mercenaries once again pounced on empty air. Han Jin let out a cold laugh. With a flick of his wrist, the black light bounced up like a snake and wrapped around the neck of one of the mercenaries with incomparable speed. Then Han Jin raised his hand, and the mercenary's neck burst out with a bloody light. A huge head flew high into the air along with a fountain of blood. The other mercenary let out a shrill scream, as if he could feel the pain of his companion. Then, he rolled and crawled toward the other end of the hall. His target was still the young girl. Han Jin's wrist flicked again, and the black light streaked across the sky with an ear-piercing screech. It chased after the mercenary like a maggot attached to a bone. A long line of blood suddenly bloomed, and in the next moment, the mercenary's head, neck, and body were neatly split into 2 halves. They flew into the air, and were still spinning rapidly with the 2 halves as the center. Countless drops of blood, different colored liquids, and organs were continuously whipped around the other half of the body. countless drops of blood, different colored liquids, and organs were scattered in all directions with the two halves of the body rapidly spinning. The scene was extremely tragic. Not to mention the survivors, even the merciless Gibran felt his scalp tingle. He looked at Han Jin without saying a word. Han Jin's hand shook, and the black light flashed and disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared. Han Jin's gaze fell on his own robe sleeve, and he muttered softly, "Damn it, you." Cromwell finally jumped up. In fact, his reaction wasn't slow. When Gibran attacked, he wanted to support him, but when he saw clearly that it was Gibran, he shrank back timidly. Then, he wanted to support this side, but the way Han Jin appeared was too strange, and the battle scene was too violent. Cromwell wanted to observe a little longer, but with this delay, his subordinates were all killed in the blink of an eye. "You dare!" A few figures appeared from the broken hall door, and Cromwell immediately shut his mouth. He saw Juventus, the vice president of the Mercenary Association, here. No matter what, it wasn't his turn to take out the Mercenary Association sign. Juventus' gaze swept over Han Jin, then turned to Cromwell. Today, Han Jin had given him too many surprises. Whether it was the incomparably powerful magic or the fierce and unpredictable fighting style just now, he was shocked and puzzled. But now wasn't the time to think. "Sasu, are you all right?" Han Jin asked calmly. Gibran had already cut the ropes on Sasua's body. Sasu moved his arms and legs while saying, "I'm fine, but she..." Sasu couldn't help but look at the corner of the hall. The girl was still lying there quietly, her eyes half closed. Whether it was hitting the ceiling or falling to the ground, she didn't react at all, like a living dead. "It's good that you're fine. Raphael, you don't know what happened." Sasu suppressed the anger in his heart, and then used the shortest words to explain what had happened. Finally, he said, "Raphael, this guy has been looking for us." Everyone's expression changed when they looked at Cromwell, especially Sunir, Yelena, and Julia, who were the most furious. Although this continent was chaotic and cruel, there should always be a bottom line when doing things. Was it fun to bully a helpless girl? Even if you took a fancy to her beauty and wanted to possess her and play with her, you didn't have to beat her only family to death, right? Good, good. Juventus was so angry that he laughed and said coldly, "Cromwell, you've done well. From now on, you're no longer a member of the Mercenary Association. Hand over the medal, now." He was still imagining that everything was a misunderstanding, but now he was furious. Even if this matter had nothing to do with Han Jin, he would never let Cromwell go. Cromwell's expression changed slightly. He understood what it meant to be abandoned by the Mercenary Association at this time, but he didn't explain. He took off his medal and threw it on the ground. "You!" Juventus was even more furious, but Han Jin hadn't made a decision yet, so he couldn't overstep his boundaries. He could only walk forward and bend down to pick up the medal, then stare at Cromwell with cold eyes. No matter what Han Jin did, as long as Cromwell was still breathing, he would let this guy know how powerful he was. Han Jin's eyes scanned the old man on the ground. "Looking for us? He wants to know Chi Li's whereabouts. Tell me, why are you looking for Chi Li?" Han Jin asked softly. "What else can it be? It can't be anything good." Sasu snorted coldly. It was clear that Cromwell was trying to use violence to find out Chi Li's whereabouts, so he must be full of malice. Cromwell didn't say a word, and just stood there quietly. "Who's Chi Li?" Yelena asked in a low voice. "She's our companion," Sunir also replied in a low voice. "You don't want to say?" Han Jin walked towards Cromwell with an indifferent face. "The Miss Chi Li you're looking for is now in Black Raven City, do you hear me? I've answered what you wanted to know, so it's time for you to answer my question. Tell me, why are you looking for her?" "Black Raven City. You're Zagun's people?" Yelena was shocked and looked at Sunir in disbelief. Majordomo Gale, who was behind her, also had a solemn look on his face. His eyes flickered, and no one knew what he was thinking. "What are you talking about?" Sunir said in a reproachful tone. "Zagun's army has been driven away by us. Now, Black Raven City is our own city." "I see. I'm sorry, Sunir." Yelena felt a little embarrassed. She shouldn't have doubted her good friends just because she heard rumors. Yelena was fine, but Majordomo Gale and Juventus were shocked. With their experience, they didn't believe that a strong person could be born out of thin air. First of all, there must be a suitable environment for a strong person to grow. After hearing Sunir's explanation, they started to make wild guesses. Could it be that Han Jin had been fighting against Zagund all this time? Cromwell didn't hear the conversation between Yelena and Sunir. His attention was focused on Han Jin, who was getting closer and closer. "Sir, what do you want to do? Let me give you a piece of advice. It's best to think more and be more cautious. Otherwise, you'll definitely regret it." "I don't see what you have that would make me cautious," Han Jin said calmly. "Haha. Sir Dismark is waiting for my news." Cromwell forced a smile. Can you think more about it? And I didn't hurt your friends. It's all a misunderstanding." The expressions of the people around them changed. No one would have thought that Cromwell was one of Dismark's men. Juventus, in particular, was pale. It seemed that the situation in isolated Cliff City was much more dangerous than they had imagined. All the lords were scrambling to infiltrate isolated Cliff City. They were treating isolated Cliff City as their meat. "Dismark? So what?" Han Jin asked calmly. "Sir, do you think you're qualified to fight against a lord?" Cromwell said sternly. "You're one of Dismark's men. You should know General Quincy, right? Do you know how he died?" Han Jin smiled. Revealing the past was a sign of immaturity on Han Jin's part. If he were a scheming person, he would rather keep the secret to himself than tell anyone. However, Han Jin was just an ordinary student before. He wasn't a general who planned strategies, a big boss who could do anything, or an assassin who walked in the underworld. Although he had experienced some bizarre and complicated things after becoming a cultivator, it was only a few years ago. Plus, he had his master's support, so his feelings were limited. Plus, it was inevitable that young people would do things out of spite. Han Jin was like that now. "General Quincy." Cromwell's expression changed drastically. He suddenly screamed, "You killed Madame Fanny! It was you!" Chapter 212. Do you still think Dismark can protect you now? Han Jin sneered. In fact, Han Jin was also a little surprised. Judging from Cromwell's expression, Madame Fanny should be someone very close to Dismark, but in his impression, he had never had any contact with such a noble lady. There must be something else going on. Cromwell suddenly chuckled until he was out of breath. After a while, he asked, "Do you think you can still protect yourself?" "So far, I've done a good job," Han Jin said flatly. "Yes, so far." Cromwell's voice suddenly lowered, and his whole body slowly shrank into a ball. Finally, he curled up on the ground, motionless. Leger rushed up and reached out to check Cromwell's breathing. He then pressed his ear to Cromwell's chest and listened for a moment. He's dead." Gibran couldn't help but frown. He went forward to check for a long time, and finally had to accept the fact that Cromwell was really dead. It was just that this guy's death was a little too inexplicable. Han Jin's eyes flickered, and he suddenly said, "You guys go out for a moment." Yelena was stunned. She vaguely guessed something, and just as she was about to speak, she suddenly realized that she was surrounded by people, so she could only swallow what she wanted to say. Gibran shrugged. In fact, he really wanted to know what Han Jin was going to do, but Han Jin didn't say. Of course, he had his own reasons, so he couldn't force him to ask. After a moment, everyone in the room retreated. Han Jin chanted in a low voice, and a talisman formed in the air. Then, it turned into countless stars and shot in all directions, attaching themselves to the walls, the ceiling, and the ground. Unfortunately, it was daytime and the sun was too strong. If it had been nighttime, the countless stars would have been very beautiful. Bismarck has been fighting with Sigund. Although it was tough, he also learned a lot, didn't he? Han Jin said with a smile. There was no one in the room, only Han Jin talking to himself. The scene was somewhat strange. It feels good to be in this state, right? No one can see you. You can pass through all obstacles and even drill into the depths of the earth. But why didn't you run away just now? Just as Han Jin finished speaking, the stars on the left wall suddenly exploded. In the dim light, there seemed to be a shadow flashing and disappearing. Then, the stars on the ceiling, the floor, the walls, and the hall door exploded one after another. After a long time, the room finally returned to normal. Give up? Are you sure I'm talking to you now? Han Jin revealed a faint smile. I'm very curious. What did the person who blessed your body call your current appearance? Soul? I've seen ghosts before, but this is the first time I've seen a soul like yours. What's the biggest difference between a soul and a ghost? Indeed, you wouldn't know. But in my hometown, we call things like you ghosts, and I happen to be a master of ghost catching. If you were still a swordsman, it would take some effort for me to deal with you. But you turned into a ghost in front of me. Cromwell, your luck is really bad. No, I'm not lying. The first time I'm talking about is the first time now, not the first time in the past. In the past, I had to deal with things like you almost every day. In the past. This question is too complicated to explain to you clearly. Besides, don't you think you have too many questions? Han Jin smiled. Now, let me introduce you to a friend who's very similar to you. Before he finished speaking, a blood-red crystal ball appeared in Han Jin's hand. In the crystal ball, a small and exquisite skeleton suddenly pounced on the wall of the ball. A pair of flashing red black holes stared in one direction. The arm bones waved wildly, as if wanting to rush out from the inside. The momentary silence disappeared, and a series of indistinct howls resounded in the room. Countless specks of starlight exploded madly. It's useless. Have you forgotten what I said just now? I'm a master of ghost catching. If I can't even subdue things like you, what kind of master am I? Han Jin weighed the crystal ball. Immortality? I'm not lying to you. Of course, immortality is impossible, but living for a few thousand years shouldn't be a problem. However, you can't attract the attention of people like me, and you can't appear in front of us. You're too careless. Don't you think it's too late to beg for mercy now? Han Jin smiled, then threw the crystal ball out. He shouted in a low voice, "Keep!" Another faintly discernible howl was heard. The crystal ball turned a small circle in the air and returned to Han Jin's hand. A small misty mass of air appeared in the crystal ball, and the delicate skeleton pounced on the mass of air like a poisonous snake. Han Jin frowned slightly. The small and exquisite skeleton suddenly froze in place. From the outside, it could be seen clearly that the skeleton was trembling non-stop, and the two red spots in its eye sockets were getting brighter and brighter. You can't touch this thing. I have a use for it. Han Jin thought for a moment, then took out 2 talismans from the space ring. As the talismans dissipated, 10 spirits appeared out of thin air. Han Jin took out the soul-devouring pearl again, and all 10 spirits were sucked into it. This time, the small and exquisite skeleton did not hold back. It used extremely ferocious movements to tear the nearest spirit into pieces, and swallowed it whole. Han Jin kept the soul-devouring pearl in the space ring. He was in a very good mood. Ever since he read the magic book written by that lunatic, he always felt that there should be a point of convergence between Taoist techniques and magic. However, he was not sure what that point was. Perhaps, if he found that point, he would be able to discover the secrets of the 8th element. Perhaps, he would be able to open the door to a mysterious world. The spirits summoned by the 5 demons' transfer spell were actually spirits with physical forms, while the magician under Dismark was able to create real ghosts. This was too comical, and also an insult to a cultivator. Therefore, Han Jin was not in a hurry to get rid of Cromwell. He needed to understand the magician's secrets. If he had enough power, he would capture the magician and control him. He believed that the magician could provide him with inspiration. Han Jin turned around and walked out. He was a little careless and stepped on the leg of a corpse. After taking 2 steps, he thought of something and turned around again. The tip of his foot stepped on the corpse's leg again, and then a low groan came from below. "You're not dead yet?" Han Jin bent down. Dauncey lay there motionless. Although no one had attacked him from beginning to end, the bloodstains on his body were no less than those of the dead. "Get up. Stop pretending," Han Jin said with a smile. He was very happy right now because he was digesting the good news that Cromwell had brought him. However, that didn't mean that he would let Dauncey go. Dauncey still didn't move. However, some things couldn't be controlled by willpower. For example, the cold sweat on his forehead and the trembling of his fingers. "I heard from Sassu that you were very impressive back then. What's the matter now?" Han Jin's smile turned cold. "For someone like you, I wouldn't be soft-hearted even if I killed 10,000 of you, let alone one." As he finished speaking, a small flame floated down from Han Jin's palm and landed on Dauncey's chest. Dauncey barely held it in for a few seconds before he suddenly let out a heart-wrenching scream and jumped up as if he had been electrocuted. The people outside heard the scream and hurriedly rushed into the hall. They saw Dauncey jumping up and down with all his might, slapping at the flame with his hands. However, the flame was very strange. It seemed to be sticky. When Dauncey slapped at it with his hands, the flame would stick to his hands. When he brushed it with his arms, the flame would stick to his arms. Soon, his upper body was enveloped in raging flames. "Ah!" Dauncey's screams became more and more shrill as he ran around like a headless fly. Unfortunately, he was running towards Han Jin. Han Jin kicked Dauncey to the ground. If it were anyone else, they might not have dared to attack Dauncey. The raging flames were too terrifying. Dauncey rolled on the ground with all his might. Suddenly, 2 severely carbonized arms separated from his body. One of them hit the ceiling, while the other flew towards Leger. Leger hurriedly ducked down. The arm flew over his head and hit the wall. Countless sparks flew everywhere as the arm was reduced to pieces. However, each piece continued to burn. Leger broke out in a cold sweat. He cursed Dauncey, who was about to die, and retreated as far as he could. The gradually weakening screams came to an abrupt end. However, the flame didn't extinguish and continued to burn. Not long after, Dauncey's body was reduced to ashes. Only his 2 legs were left. Even the arm that had been sent flying had turned into ashes and scattered in the air. "Raphael, can you still save her?" Sassu reached out and touched the tip of the old woman's nose for a moment before looking up at Han Jin. Han Jin shook his head. There was no need to look. The old woman's skull had been smashed open, and even her brain was exposed. This kind of injury wasn't something he could save. "Sigh." Sassu sighed and turned his gaze to the young woman. This time, Sassu didn't need to say anything. Han Jin walked over, bent down, and grabbed the young woman's wrist. He listened carefully for a moment. The way he treated people was very strange. At least, most people here couldn't understand it. However, Sunir and the others had long since gotten used to it. After a moment, Han Jin picked up the young woman's head and gently opened her half-closed eyelids. He looked at her seriously and said, "She's fine. She's just in shock. Also, find her a quiet place. She'll recover after a few days." "Can she really recover?" Sassu asked. Han Jin paused. "That depends on her. Raphael, bring her to our place," Sassu said in a negotiating tone. Han Jin looked up at Sunir and the others. Apart from Leger, Sunir and Morrison's were obviously leaning toward Sasua's suggestion. He nodded. All right. Chapter 213. Han Jin was lying on his side on the bed, unconsciously tossing the blood-red crystal ball. His eyes were unfocused, as if he was thinking about something. Sunir was sitting at the head of the bed, trying her best to sew a sky-blue robe. Han Jin was not an easy person to please. For example, he didn't like to wear the swordsman's uniform. In comparison, he thought that a magic robe could accentuate his temperament better. However, he was also somewhat dissatisfied with the magic robe. He thought that the sleeves of the robe were too wide and hindered his movements. This was because his fighting style was not to release magic. Under certain circumstances, he had to engage in hand-to-hand combat like a swordsman. This kind of work naturally fell to Sunir. The robe that she had sewn for Han Jin yesterday was destroyed in the battle. Although the sleeves were only torn and could be put back on after some mending, Han Jin's reputation had spread far and wide. Countless people were paying attention to him. Sunir felt that it was necessary to ensure that Han Jin was not a joke. Therefore, she had already thrown away the robe. The robe in her hand was the one she had just bought for Han Jin. Taking apart the sleeves, cutting them, and sewing them back was a simple task for any tailor. However, it was not so easy for Sunir. It had only been an hour or so, but small beads of sweat had already seeped out from the tip of her nose. "How about we take it to the tailor's shop?" Han Jin suddenly said. He thought that Sunir was wasting her energy on this. If she had the time, she might as well use it to practice her archery. No need. Practice makes perfect. It will be much faster in the future. Sunir shook her head. Besides, we can't stay in isolated Cliff City forever. If we go to the Forest of Magic Beasts to do missions, where will you find a tailor's shop? Han Jin sighed softly. He sat up and carefully wiped the sweat off Sunir's nose. Sunir smiled. She pressed her face against Han Jin's palm. Then, she realized that her actions were too intimate. Besides, she was not used to taking the initiative. She hurriedly rolled her eyes at Han Jin. "Go away, can't you see that I'm busy?" Han Jin chuckled. He lay on his back on the bed and grabbed his soul-devouring orb. The small and exquisite skeleton was playing a game tirelessly. In fact, the soul-devouring orb was empty. There was nothing to play with. The so-called game was just to scare Cromwell's soul. Of course, it did not dare to really hurt Cromwell, but the game itself was a kind of injury. Cromwell's soul was very afraid of it. Every time it approached, Cromwell's soul would howl in fear and escape. And this game had been going on. To be precise, ever since it devoured 10 ghosts in a row, its spirit had soared. It had been playing for a whole day so far. Han Jin looked at it for a moment and took out a talisman. In the next moment, 5 more ghosts appeared in the soul-devouring orb. Sunir suddenly turned her head. She frowned slightly. After a moment of hesitation, she said, "Raphael, in the future, try not to use dark magic again." Han Jin responded, but his tone was obviously a little absent-minded. Dark magic has always been resisted by the Guild of Magic. If others misunderstand that you are a dark magic mage, it will be troublesome. Actually, this guy is very interesting. Han Jin avoided the topic. Interesting? Sunir looked at the monster that was devouring the ghosts in big mouthfuls. She could not figure out what it meant. Han Jin smiled and patted the soul-devouring orb lightly. A burst of gray smoke spewed out. Then, a skeleton that was about the height of a human appeared in the air. It was eating enthusiastically when it suddenly realized that it had left the crystal ball. It hurriedly stuffed the rest of the ghost's body into its mouth and swallowed with difficulty. Then, it wiped its mouth and paused for a moment as if it was brewing its emotions. Then, it slowly said, "I, the great." Han Jin snapped his fingers. The skeleton suddenly trembled violently, especially the 2 rows of teeth. They chattered rapidly and made a series of strange sounds. Speak properly. The skeleton returned to normal. Its skull drooped slightly, and the red light in its eyes flickered. Sunir suddenly had a feeling that the monster was secretly observing Han Jin's expression. Your most loyal servant, Harley, is ready to listen to your summons. The skeleton bent down. Although it could not show its expression, its voice was full of flattery. I already have the most loyal servant. You are at most the second. Han Jin looked at the skeleton lazily. He did not completely refine this malicious ghost. This was also considered an experiment. This malicious ghost had a certain amount of power. Combined with the spell, it should be able to greatly increase the power of the soul-devouring orb. Who? Let me kill him. The skeleton was furious. It was obviously unhappy that the first position was taken. Why don't you say that again? Han Jin said with a smile that did not look like a smile. Although the skeleton's reaction was a little slow, it could still tell that Han Jin's tone was not friendly. The two red lights fell on Sunir. It was stunned for a moment, then intentionally or otherwise, it changed the topic. Master, it's the best. Is that so? Han Jin laughed. Sunir blinked. She still did not understand what the skeleton meant by the best. Of course. A long, long time ago the great… Han Jin snapped his fingers again. All of the skeleton's memories turned into a series of clicks. This time, it finally understood what Han Jin hated the most. Wise, and incomparably powerful master, your most humble servant, Harley, did not mean to offend you. The skeleton carefully studied its words. It seems like you had a very high status when you were alive. Have you never tried to please anyone? That's too unnatural. Han Jin laughed. Of course humble Harley. The skeleton finally reacted and changed the great to humble in time. All right. Han Jin waved his hand. He never paid attention to the situation. I like to be straightforward. You can speak normally. Where were we? Speaking of your maid, master. You really have a high standard. If I was still alive, I would be willing to exchange all the women in my palace for you. Even if it's just for one night, I would be satisfied. You're right. Han Jin said with a straight face. If I were still alive, I would be happy to exchange all the women in my palace for you. From a man's point of view, the skeleton's words were not wrong. Exchanging all the women in the palace for one woman highlighted Han Jin's taste. However, Sunir was furious. Bastard! Please be polite, miss. The skeleton said in a neutral tone. You and I are of equal status. What right do you have to insult me? Besides, I am Master's most loyal warrior. I can protect Master when he is in danger. I can destroy all the enemies for Master. What can you do? The only thing you can do is to please Master in bed. The skeleton was indeed a superior when it was alive. Although it had become the spirit of the soul-devouring orb, and its life was completely controlled by someone else, it still had a strong desire to win. Therefore, it regarded Sunir as a competitor. It was extremely sarcastic and attacked her ability. It also highlighted its own strengths in an attempt to influence Han Jin's view. Unfortunately, it chose the wrong opponent. The most loyal servant Han Jin mentioned was not Sunir, but Stillberg, who was far away in Black Raven City. Sunir was so angry that her lips turned white. However, she did not have the experience of cursing. Moreover, the skeleton's words were too explicit. She did not know how to fight back. Sunir, you have this kind of strength? Han Jin said while holding back his laughter. What? Pleasing me in bed? When are you going to show me your strength? Before Han Jin could finish his words, he suddenly found that Sunir's eyes had become wet. He realized that his joke had gone too far. Sunir had a very high status among the elves. Who would dare to say such vulgar words in front of her? Han Jin quickly sat up and hugged Sunir from behind. Sunir struggled hard. She felt wronged. If it was only the monster who had insulted her, it would not be a big deal. However, Han Jin should not have joined forces with the monster to deal with her. I was wrong. It's my fault. Han Jin hurriedly whispered in Sunir's ear. After coaxing her for a long time, Sunir finally stopped struggling. Han Jin's eyes finally fell on the skeleton. Sunir must still be feeling uncomfortable. He had to find a way to calm her down. Harley, let me introduce you. This is my wife, Sunir. The skeleton suddenly turned into a statue. Its mouth was also wide open. Han Jin suddenly understood that the phrase jaw dropping to the ground was not just a description. It was something that could happen. At least, Harley's jaw was very unstable, as if it could fall off at any time. Madam, the skeleton suddenly screamed, your eyes are brighter than the moon in the sky. Go away. Sunir said angrily. The skeleton was stunned. Then, it really started rolling on the ground. For it, this action was not difficult. Its body was made of smoke. It just needed to control the smoke to move forward. Idiot. Han Jin shook his head. The skeleton kept rolling in the room. After rolling a few times, it stopped and looked at Han Jin and Sunir's faces. Then, it continued rolling. Forget it. Don't be angry with it. It must have been a person of high status when it was alive. It's so pitiful for it to end up like this. Han Jin comforted her in a low voice for a long time. Finally, Sunir's face recovered. Sunir, go and call Hogan here. It should have been yesterday. It can't be delayed any longer. He was only forced to surrender. If this drags on, he will definitely cause trouble for us. I understand. Sunir nodded. She glared at the skeleton fiercely and quickly left the room. Do you feel that you are very sad? Han Jin asked flatly. Master, it is my greatest honor to be able to serve the wise and powerful master, the skeleton said in a flattering tone. Tell me the truth. Han Jin smiled. If you want to be valued and trusted by me, you must first remember that I hate lies. The skeleton suddenly became silent. Chapter 214. It didn't take long before Hogan followed Sunir into the room. Hogan was shocked to see Harley floating in the air. Of course, he knew that it was a dark creature. Master, you were looking for me? Hogan hurriedly lowered his head and asked timidly. Your subordinates have all put on the halo of restraint? Han Jin still had a lazy expression on his face. The halo of restraint he was talking about was the headband that the slaves wore. It was said that the ice mages of Cold Shadow City invented it. It could be said that the halo of restraint was a very vicious magic tool. When they first learned about the effects of the halo of will, Morrison's, Sasu, and the others, including Han Jin and Gibran, all felt their scalps tingle. There was nothing strange about the outer ring, but the key was the 2 crystal nails that were half a finger long and could explode at any time. When the mages of Cold Shadow City put the headband on the captives, they would drive the 2 crystal nails into the captives' heads. From this, it could be seen that the mages of Cold Shadow City were not only proficient in the art of puppetry, but also had a great understanding of the human body structure. 2 nails that were half a finger long would not kill the captives, nor would it affect their daily activities. However, the warriors could no longer release combat energy, and the mages could no longer gather magic. Otherwise, the crystal nails would immediately explode. Moreover, as long as the ring of inhibition was worn, it was difficult to take it off. According to Hogan, along the way, dozens of slaves would die every day because they tried to take off the ring of inhibition. After the crystal nail was fixed, it would not cause pain, but if one wanted to use violence to remove or cut off the headband, the crystal nail would move slightly and cause fatal damage. In fact, the success rate of putting on the halo of restraint was not 100%. If 10 slaves were put on the halo of restraint, there would always be 1 or 2 slaves who would die on the spot. The location of the crystal nails had to be precise, and the process of inserting the crystal nails had to be done with full concentration. There could not be any mistake. Using this method to control the slaves was too cruel. This made Morrison's and the others' impression of Cold Shadow City even worse. "Yes, master," Hogan replied in a low voice. Han Jin was silent for a moment before he nodded. "You've done well. Come here." Hogan walked over submissively until he was less than 2 meters away from Han Jin and stood there obediently. "Raise your head and look at me." Hogan was stunned and raised his head to look at Han Jin. Their gazes collided. Hogan was a little timid and wanted to shift his gaze elsewhere, but Han Jin's eyes seemed to have an attractive force that firmly attracted his attention. "Snatch!" Han Jin shouted, and a dazzling white light shot out, hitting Hogan's eyes. Hogan opened his mouth in shock. He suddenly felt that his mind was not clear, and the rhythm of his thinking became very slow. He wanted to say, "Master, what's wrong?" However, he actually forgot how to pronounce those words. He wanted to smile, but he didn't know how to control his muscles. At this moment, Harley's body turned into a line of smoke and entered Hogan's mouth. Hogan's body trembled violently, and his face turned green and white. After a moment, one of his pupils turned a strange red, but his body's reaction gradually calmed down. "Now, do you have anything to tell me?" Han Jin asked calmly. Hogan showed a pained expression. His lips opened and closed like a thirsty fish. It looked like he wanted to say something, but didn't want to. After a while, Hogan smiled and said, "Master, you have to be careful of those magicians from Cold Shadow City." "Be careful of them?" Han Jin sneered. "Why should I be careful of them? They aren't affected by the halo of restraint. I put the halo of restraint on them myself. No one knows it better than me, hee." Hogan showed a flattering smile. "In the beginning, I purposely made a mistake and let the crystal nail explode on the spot. A person's head was blown apart, and his brain was splattered all over the ground. This scene. TSK, that magician called Yelena couldn't bear to watch anymore, so she left. Only that big idiot called Morrison's was left. What could he understand? I broke the crystal nail a long time ago. In fact, the halo of restraint worn by those magicians had no effect at all." "That's it?" Han Jin's expression was calm. He already expected that those magicians from Cold Shadow City wouldn't be honest. Hogan's confession only confirmed his guess, so there was nothing to be surprised about. "There's more." Hogan remembered something. "Those magicians have already discussed and decided to escape together tomorrow night. This is isolated Cliff City. Where can they escape to? As long as they can escape outside the city, the gargoyles will meet them." "Gargoyles? Looks like you're involved too?" "Of course, if it weren't for my help, they wouldn't have the guts to escape," Hogan said in a boastful tone, his face full of pride. Han Jin looked at Hogan quietly. Maybe it was because he no longer had any reservations, or maybe it was because he was still in a daze, but this time, Hogan no longer avoided Han Jin's gaze. He smiled and met Han Jin's gaze. "You go and kill them all," Han Jin said in a low voice. "Yes, master," Hogan said without hesitation, then walked out of the room. "Is this dark magic?" Sunir asked with difficulty. Han Jin was just about to speak when a shout came from outside. "Not good, Master Raphael." As soon as he finished, Saxon burst open the door, panting. "What's the matter?" Han Jin asked in surprise. Although Winston didn't attract as much attention as Gibran, it was just a matter of attitude. In fact, the battle experience of the Reaper mercenary team was no less than that of Gibran's Red Vanguard. It was definitely not a small matter to make Saxon like this. When you were on a mission last time, didn't you leave that lady's house with the Mercenary Association?" "Slow down, don't rush," Han Jin asked tentatively. "Sylvia?" Yes. It's Miss Sylvia's house. The Mercenary Association returned it to the Morrisons a long time ago, but since you're all living here, there's no one to look after it. It's already winter and the homeless are freezing, but they don't care about anything. The people of the Mercenary Association are afraid that the homeless will go in and cause trouble, so they've been sending a few mercenaries to take turns looking after it, in case Miss Sylvia comes back and causes trouble. And then, this afternoon, an old man and a young man suddenly walked into Miss Sylvia's house. I don't know what happened, but when the mercenaries went up to question them, they were all taught a lesson. Then Sir Juventus hurried over, but Saxon smiled bitterly. Sir Juventus also suffered a loss. Suffered a loss? Yes, I was there and saw it with my own eyes. That old man was like playing with a child, easily snatching Sir Juventus' sword. You were there? Did Winston also make a move? Yes. Saxon's face reddened. Seeing Saxon's expression, Han Jean knew that Winston's end wouldn't be much better than Juventus. Let's go and take a look. Wait, my lord. Saxon hurriedly stopped Han Jean. Winston told me to tell you that the old man is most likely a supra-class master. He wants you to make ample preparations before going. A supra-class master. Han Jin's body trembled. Although everyone thought that he was a dragon slayer, he knew very well that with his current strength, if he were to fight against Gibran and the others, he would have a good chance of winning. However, if he were to fight against a supra-class master, he would be courting death. Han Jean slowly took a breath. Where's Yelena? I met Lady Yelena at the door. She has already rushed over with Majordomo Gale and the others. No need to make any preparations, let's go, Han Jean said decisively. After all, the people from the Mercenary Association had stood up for him. In other words, now that they had suffered a loss, he had the responsibility to help them get back at Yelena. Even if he was thick-skinned and didn't care about the Mercenary Association, how could he not care about Winston? Even if he didn't care about Winston, how could he just watch Yelena suffer? The most important thing was that the opponent didn't hurt anyone even when he had the absolute advantage. Obviously, he didn't want to provoke a conflict. With Yelena's competitive temper, it was very likely that she would worsen the situation. Saxon was horrified. He had heard about this before. Two super-class masters wouldn't easily start a conflict, unless it was an extreme conflict caused by huge benefits, or if they were 100% confident in themselves. In fact, Winston had a hidden meaning when he said to make ample preparations. He didn't expect Han Jean to rush over and beat up the old man, nor did he want to provoke a supra-class master. He hoped that Han Jean would make his appearance more imposing, so that the old man would be wary and pave the way for peace talks. Saxon also understood this, so when he saw Han Jean leaving without making any preparations, he was very shocked. Facing a superclass master, did Han Jean really have the strength to win? Saxon acted as the coachman and drove the carriage to the scene of the incident at the fastest speed. When they were about to reach Sylvia's house, they saw a group of mercenaries surrounding it from afar. Han Jean couldn't see the situation inside, so he simply jumped into the carriage. However, when he saw the people inside, he couldn't help but be stunned. Seeing Han Jean arrive, the mercenaries let out deafening cheers. In isolated Cliff City, Han Jean had become a big shot that everyone looked up to. The mercenaries' confidence in Han Jean was even stronger than their confidence in themselves. In the field, Majordomo Gale was confronting an old man with a thin face. Yelena was behind him, eager to join in, but she didn't dare to because Majordomo Gale's attitude towards her was too strict. This was the first time in her memory that this had happened. Hearing the cheers, the two men looked outside at the same time. Han Jean was standing on the carriage, his position very conspicuous. Then, the young man who had been hiding in the corner suddenly shouted more excitedly than the mercenaries, "Young master! Young master! I'm here!" Chapter 2:15. As soon as Han Jean jumped down from the carriage, Stilberg ran towards him. His eyes were red and his lips were trembling. Obviously, he was extremely emotional. Putting aside the fact that they were master and servant, Stilberg had given far more than Han Jin. Ever since he could remember, his environment and his parents had instilled in him the idea that he was born for Han Jin and that he would die for Han Jin. Therefore, Stilberg never had any dreams. His biggest wish was to be praised by Han Jin. In the blink of an eye, they had been separated for a few months. After Han Jin left Stilberg, everything was normal. He lived his life as usual. However, Stilberg could not do it. He had never left Han Jin. Even if they were in the most miserable situation, they still suffered together and depended on each other. In the first few weeks he could barely control himself. However, after a long time, he could not sit or rest. The reason why he was able to leave Black Raven City was because Lang Ning was in trouble. On the other hand, he could not stand Stilberg's endless nagging. "Young master," Stilberg called out, but he did not know what to say next. Han Jin was very happy. He patted Stilberg's shoulder hard and then turned his eyes to Guevara. "How are you?" "Thanks to you, my spirit is getting better and better," Guevara said with a smile. "Young master, I have been using the magic you taught me to take care of him every day. How could he not be well?" Stilberg shouted. "Don't try to show off." Guevara shook his head. "If Zagund had your skills back then, I would have surrendered long ago." Stilberg's face turned red. Guevara had used similar words to mock him along the way. If there were only the two of them, he would have just laughed because he knew his identity. However, being mocked in front of Han Jin made him very uncomfortable. At this moment, a loud shout came from outside. "Get out of my way! I want to see who dares to cause trouble in my house. Damn it! If I don't beat you up!" Before he could finish, the crowd had already moved aside. Morrison's was stunned when he saw Guevara. He turned around and walked away, but then he felt that it was inappropriate to walk away like this. After all, they had not seen each other for a few months, and Guevara was his elder. He slowly turned around and smiled. "Not bad, kid. Your temper has grown in the past few months," Guevara said with a smile. "How would I know it's you?" Moxink smiled obsequiously. "Raphael, this is..." Yelena could not help but ask. Han Jin looked at Guevara and saw that Guevara did not say anything. He knew that Guevara had left the decision to him. However, after thinking about it, he had been carrying the title of Dragon Slayer for the past few days, but he was not confident at all. Guevara's arrival made him feel more at ease. Han Jin smiled and said, "This is Master Guevara." "Dragon Knight Guevara?" Majordomo Gale was shocked. "You are?" Guevara asked softly. "My name is Gale. I have always been working for Master Solomon." Majordomo Gale bowed slightly. "Dark left hand?" Guevara's eyes lit up. When I was young, my friend joked with me and gave me a nickname. I did not expect it to reach your ears." Majordomo Gale laughed. "Hello." Yelena walked to Majordomo Gale's side and bowed respectfully to Guevara. "This is Solomon's daughter?" Guevara saw that Yelena's position was slightly higher than Majordomo Gale's, and he knew in his heart. Yes. Guevara looked at Yelena from head to toe. Because she had been planning to join the battle, Yelena had already taken out her magic wand. The determined look on her face had not faded, and she gave people a feeling of heroism. Coupled with her beautiful face, she was particularly eye-catching. Even Guevara could not help but take a few more glances at her. "Solomon has a good daughter." Guevara sighed softly. No one knew what he was thinking, but a deep sadness flashed in his eyes. The surrounding mercenaries looked at each other. For them, the name Guevara was not unfamiliar. 20 years ago, Guevara was an all-powerful and invincible general. He defeated the Lord of the Holy Crown City, Dismark, and forced him to retreat to his nest. Even if they did not know Guevara, they should at least know the meaning of the words, Dragon Knight. Also, Majordomo Gale, who confronted Guevara, was definitely not simple because Guevara used honorifics to address him. To be precise, Isolated Cliff City was a paradise for ordinary high-level professionals. If one's strength had reached the top level or higher, he or she would not stay in Isolated Cliff City under normal circumstances. The benefits gained from the game of competing for the world far exceeded that of completing tasks. The feeling of controlling the life and death of countless people was not something that a few top-grade magic crystals could compare with. The appearance of Han Jin had already become the focus of the entire city. Now, several powerful professionals had gathered together. This was a grand occasion that Isolated Cliff City had never seen before. Master Raphael, what do you think? Juventus walked over with a bitter smile. Let me introduce you. Han Jin turned around and said, This is the president of the Mercenary Association, Master Juventus. Vice President, Juventus hurriedly said. Han Jin smiled and then pulled Winston. This is my good friend Winston. This is Saxon, this is Paul, and this is Paydi. They are all members of the Reaper mercenary team. Everyone greeted Guevara. Guevara was not a person who liked to put on airs, and it was Han Jin who was enthusiastically introducing him. Even if he did not give face to others, he still had to take care of Han Jin's face. Therefore, his attitude was very amiable. Let's find a place to talk. It's not convenient here. Han Jin looked around. Winston, let's go back to your place. Okay, Winston immediately replied. Then I'll go back with Saxon and the others to prepare. After he finished speaking, he gave Han Jin a look. Han Jin did not know what Winston was trying to do, but since Winston said to prepare, of course he would give him time to prepare. Sylvia's house was right behind them, so the group walked in one by one. The mercenaries of the Mercenary Association rushed into the room first, but it was too late to clean up. They could only sacrifice their sleeves and randomly sweep the dust off the tables and chairs. Sylvia's house was not big, and there were only 5 chairs in the living room for guests. Han Jin, Guevara, Gale, and Juventus each had one. Even Sunir did not have a place to sit, so she had to stand beside Han Jin. On the other side was naturally Stillberg. His expression was a little strange, and he stole glances at Sunir from time to time. It was normal for him to stand there, because he was Han Jin's servant. But what about Sunir? Sunir also noticed that something was wrong. His eyes kept moving between Han Jin and Sunir. Sunir's face was slightly red. Speaking of which, her relationship with Guevara was the strangest. They were originally irreconcilable enemies, but now? She did not know how to describe it. The first thing they talked about was the cause of the conflict. After Guevara and Stillberg walked in, the mercenaries of the Mercenary Association immediately rushed in. Their tone was very unfriendly, and Guevara, of course, would not tolerate being looked down upon. As a result, he taught those mercenaries a lesson. Those mercenaries told Guevara to wait and see, and then Juventus and Winston came in angrily, followed by Han Jin. This was not a big deal. Juventus apologized profusely, and Guevara did not pursue the matter. The atmosphere became more and more harmonious. As the saying goes, the older the ginger, the spicier it is. If a young person like Yelena really hated someone, her face would more or less show some signs of it. But Guevara and Gale would not make such a low-level mistake. Moreover, with fate here, it was very likely that they would become friends. Of course, they had to find a way to make the atmosphere more harmonious. At least, they would not provoke each other. After chatting for a while, Saxon finally ran over and invited Han Jin and the others to eat. Although he knew what Winston had gone to do, Han Jin did not expect that Winston had prepared such a grand scene. From afar, they could see the Reaper mercenary team's base. The snow at the entrance of the street had been cleaned up. At the entrance of the base, there were about 17 or 18 girls lined up on the left and right, waiting quietly and respectfully. When they got closer, Han Jin recognized that they were the slaves brought by the magicians of Cold Shadow City. After the magicians of Cold Shadow City surrendered, there were two voices in the Mercenary Association about how to deal with these slaves. One was to sell them, and the other was to restore their freedom. Both voices had their reasons. Han Jin had not yet paid back his debt. Of course, the Mercenary Association did not care about such a small amount of money. They guessed that Han Jin needed a large amount of magic crystals, so they decided to exchange all the slaves for magic crystals as if they had bought them. Then, they would give the magic crystals to Han Jin. They thought that Han Jin would be very happy. The latter was more far-sighted. After all, they had already offended Cold Shadow City. Restoring the slaves' freedom would be a great help to them. The hatred of the destruction of their country, as well as the humiliation they suffered, would not be easily forgotten. However, the Mercenary Association only had the right to make suggestions, not decisions, because Hogan had surrendered to Han Jin. However, Han Jin went to save Sasu halfway and handed the matter over to Winston. He then went back to meditate and never mentioned anything about what to do. The Mercenary Association had no choice but to book more than 20 hotels and put the slaves inside. The food and drinks of thousands of slaves was not a small amount, and they also had to send people to watch over them. However, this was also one of the smartest things they could do. I won't say it, I'll just do it. When you realize in the future that you owe me too much, even if you can't be my comrade, you can't be so heartless, right? Of course, the reason why the Association of Mercenaries dared to make such an investment was that they had carefully observed Han Jin's behavior and his attitude towards his friends. From this, they had inferred Han Jin's preferences and characteristics. They believed that their efforts would not go unrewarded. As a full agent, Winston could of course order the slaves around as he pleased. Otherwise, even if he wanted to show off, he would not be able to find so many people to use. "This is where you live?" Guevara was a little surprised. He looked at the beautiful girls and the long red carpet that stretched from the hall to the street. "I don't know." Han Jin smiled bitterly. "Anyway, I can't recognize it." Chapter 216. When Han Jin and the others were full, Guevara called Han Jin out for a private talk. Everyone knew that it must be something confidential, so they didn't disturb them. Guevara told them about the recent situation in Black Raven City in detail. During the months when Han Jin was away, great changes had taken place there. The 4 castellans of the Bite Man had jointly launched an attack. The conspiracy of Woodrow, the chief sheriff of Bite Man City, had been exposed too early, so he hadn't made sufficient preparations. After holding on for a month, Bite Man City was finally breached. However, Woodrow's army wasn't completely wiped out. He retreated to Black Raven City with his remaining troops and occupied Nuremberg a month and a half ago. Lang Ning put forward a very sharp opinion on this matter. If the 4 castellans really wanted to keep Woodrow here, Woodrow would never have escaped, let alone with some of his remaining troops. To be precise, the 4 castellans were very jealous when they saw that Lang Ning led Riptide to easily capture Black Raven City. This meant that they didn't want to be the castellans of Peaceful City anymore. Instead, they wanted to expand their territory, and the empty Black Raven City naturally became their target. They drove Woodrow to Black Raven City in order to use Woodrow to weaken Riptide's strength and serve as a vanguard for their invasion. Unfortunately, Lang Ning had a very keen sense of military affairs. When he heard that Woodrow's army had fled into the territory of Black Raven City, he immediately felt that something was wrong. He sent out a large number of cavalrymen to investigate the entire border. A group of cavalrymen found some strange traces. Guevara then personally followed the traces and found the hiding place of the Bite Man coalition. Based on the current serious situation, Lang Ning decided to plan a big war. Woodrow was just a little worm. Although his personal strength was strong, most of his troops were temporarily recruited and didn't have much fighting power. The confrontation between Lang Ning and Woodrow was just to numb the Biteman coalition. In fact, Lang Ning didn't have much confidence. Compared to the Biteman coalition, his Riptide was at an absolute disadvantage in terms of military strength, equipment, and supplies. Their only bright spot was their fighting power. Lang Ning was very clear that they couldn't fight a protracted war. Black Raven City had been destroyed by Zagund, so his Riptide was getting less and less. The Biteman coalition, on the other hand, had a strong follow-up ability after a long period of recuperation. Moreover, Lang Ning had a very bold plan. The Biteman coalition deliberately drove Woodrow into Black Raven City in order to exhaust his strength. Therefore, Lang Ning wanted to fight back and do his best to wipe out the coalition, then immediately counterattack the Biteman coalition. The result would directly determine whether his plan could be carried out. If the coalition suffered heavy losses, his counterattack would be irresistible and unstoppable. If the coalition escaped, the four Castellans would rely on the city to resist. With the current strength of Black Raven City, it would be impossible to support a full-scale protracted war. Lang Ning didn't think highly of Black Raven City, at least not in the short term. Zagund relied entirely on the cavemen to support his army. However, this race was very strange. They could be the lowest slaves in the abyss, but they didn't want to be ridden on by humans. No matter how Lang Ning proposed favorable policies or threatened them with death, their only answer was that they would never cooperate. Half a month after Leger left, Lang Ning, who had been trying to negotiate with the cavemen, finally lost his patience and ordered a massacre. The massacre involved the entire province. Wherever Riptide's iron hooves passed, the cavemen's blood flowed like rivers. More than 400 villages and towns in the province were all turned into ruins. The reputation that Leger's father, the Knight of Conrad, had painstakingly built for Riptide was also destroyed. People outside had even jokingly called Riptide the Blood Army. Many generals in the army objected, but Lang Ning's attitude was very firm. He said that no army could survive in an environment with internal and external troubles. Since the external troubles couldn't be solved for the time being, they had to concentrate on solving the internal problems first. After that, Lang Ning sent people to recruit refugees. The conditions were very generous. They were given permanent land for free, and were exempted from all taxes for a certain period of time, as long as they were willing to work hard to farm. Zagund and Dismark had been fighting for years, and the number of refugees was like a rolling snowball. When they heard Lang Ning's conditions, they naturally flocked to him. However, it was impossible for Lang Ning to rely on refugees to support the army. On the contrary, he had to take out a lot of things to support the refugees first. It was winter now. Could he just watch the refugees freeze to death and starve to death? To put it bluntly, Lang Ning was just sitting there and eating, relying on the military resources that Zagund had accumulated in the past to barely survive. The current Lang Ning was like a person who was using his hands to climb the edge of a cliff. He wanted to go up, but his body was too heavy and he couldn't move. He needed someone to give him a push from behind. After thinking about it, Lang Ning could only place his hope on Han Jin. After all, their previous experience had proven that they had a common language and could understand each other. In order to completely wipe out the Biteman army, Lang Ning needed a large amount of military resources. Looking at the numbers listed on the list, Han Jin felt his scalp tingle. When he asked Sunir to buy magic crystals, Sunir said that it would cost at least 100,000 gold coins. Han Jin was very shocked. Looking at it now, it was nothing. The first item on the list was 120 magic crystal cannons. Lang Ning had explained it very clearly. No matter if it was an ambush, a surprise attack under the cover of the sky, the terrain, or a direct confrontation, a battle depended on people after all. No matter how good a plan was, it could only seize the strategic advantage at most. Only by relying on more than 100 magic crystal cannons could the defense line of the Biteman army be torn apart in an instant, laying the foundation for completely wiping out the army in one fell swoop, and at the same time, greatly reducing the casualty rate of Riptide. Han Jin remembered very clearly that when the Biteman had seized the 4 magic crystal cannons, someone had shouted that they had made a fortune. This was a total of 120 magic crystal cannons. And it would be best if it could be done in the near future. Even an old hen would need a few months to lay 120 eggs. Looking further down, Lang Ning was actually imagining the scene after the magic crystal cannons were in place. The number of magicians was seriously insufficient, so he hoped that Han Jin could recruit more than 400 magicians in isolated Cliff City. But 400 was only the bottom line, and there was no upper limit. Lang Ning's meaning was very clear: the more magicians, the better. Looking further down, it was the problem of magic crystals. For magic crystal cannons already required a large number of magic crystals, and 120 magic crystal cannons required an astronomical amount of magic crystals. The magic crystals that Lang Ning had seized in Black Raven City were far from enough. In comparison, the armor, weapons, and other requirements were not even worth mentioning. Fortunately, Han Jin's spirit was very strong, and Lang Ning had also written that in a few days, his soldiers would depart with almost all the gold coins in Black Raven City and rush to isolated Cliff City. However, Lang Ning also admitted that the gold coins he had prepared were not enough, and hoped that Han Jin could help him think of a solution. But judging from Lang Ning's sincere and almost pleading tone, it was not that the gold coins he had prepared were not enough, but far from enough. Han Jin put the list on the table with a stiff movement without saying a word. "It's all up to you," Guevara sighed. "Stop, I didn't say I could do it." Han Jin was really anxious. How many millions of gold coins were needed? Or tens of millions? He only had a few hundred gold coins with him now. The dragon crystals and dragon scales in the space ring were worth some money, but it was far from enough to sell them all. Lang Ning's hair has turned white these days, Guevara sighed again. "It's not that I don't want to help, but that I can't." Han Jin said, "Let's not talk about me. Even the Lord of Holy Crown City, Dismark, who is famous for his wealth, can't take out so many things at once?" After saying that, Han Jin turned around and was about to leave. There was no need to talk about this matter anymore. He really couldn't take it out. What's more, when they seized so many magic crystals, the generals of Riptide treated them as the possession of the Legion. They didn't even intend to share some with them, and treated him, Han Jin, as an outsider. This made him very uncomfortable. In Lang Ning's heart, you are already a lord that he can pledge his loyalty to. Now that he is in trouble, if he doesn't turn to you, then who should he turn to? Guevara said lightly. Han Jin was stunned. When they met in the past, he faintly felt that between him and Leger, Guevara appreciated him very much, and even showed the intention of supporting him. Lang Ning was the same. He often came to see him, but rarely went to see Leger. However, no one dared to talk about it. He and Leger were friends. If they talked about it, it would seem like a power grab. It would be too hurtful. Lang Ning is a real talent, but in other aspects, he is a little clumsy. The most valuable thing is that he knows what he can and can't do. If I were you, if I were a few decades younger, I would never give up such a trustworthy general. Guevara stared at Han Jin. "Do you really want to give up?" "This is not a matter of giving up or not." Han Jin smiled bitterly. "Lang Ning's plan is very bold. If we can really wipe out the Biteman Alliance, the entire Biteman Alliance will be yours. These things are nothing. Even if we have to borrow them, we have to prepare for Lang Ning's needs." Guevara said slowly. "Borrow? You make it sound so easy." Han Jin smiled bitterly. "Where can I borrow them? Who can lend them to me? I am talking about us." Guevara smiled. "Why do you think I came here?" "You mean, I am friends with the president of the isolated Cliff City's Chamber of Commerce, Hallman, Gavara said softly. Gavara said softly, I'll look for him tomorrow to think of a way. But I haven't seen him for 20 years, and I'm an old man with no one to rely on. It's hard to say if he'll recognize me as a friend. The Chamber of Commerce in isolated Cliff City can provide these things? Of course. Gavara said in a playful tone, in this chaotic world, who doesn't have some means to protect themselves? Do you think any random army can take over isolated Cliff City? More than 100 magic crystal cannons. Haha, the Chamber of Commerce in isolated Cliff City has stockpiled much more than this. How many years has it been since isolated Cliff City was built? Since you have a way to solve this, why did Lang Ning write to me? Is he trying to scare me? Han Jin smiled bitterly. You should know what Lang Ning and I mean. If we talk about it openly, it will be pointless, Gavara said softly. Gavara said in a low voice, the generals of the Riptide Regiment all agree with Ronning's plan. They want to fight their way back to Biteman. However, without a large amount of military resources, it will be difficult for them to defeat the Allied forces, let alone wipe them out. Only you can solve this problem. Chapter 217. Han Jin remained silent. He knew very well that Gavara's words were heart-wrenching. There were some things that could not be failed. If you failed, you would never have the chance to make a comeback. Gavara was one of those people. 20 years ago, Gavara was just over 40 years old. His strength was at its peak, and he had accumulated a lot of experience. He also had military power in his hands. That was the golden season when he swept across the north and south and made great achievements. Unfortunately, Wild Willow City, which had always been conservative when it came to military affairs, made an unexpected move. They sent the Silver Horse Army to stab Gavara in the back. His ambitions and dreams were all gone. Sunir hated Gavara, but Gavara had more reasons to hate Sunir. However, after living in seclusion for a while and suffering from the pain of being imprisoned, Gavara's sharpness had long been worn down by time and hardship. At this moment, the person sitting beside Han Jin was not an all-powerful and invincible general, but a lonely and miserable old man. Han Jin suddenly remembered a saying. Since ancient times, heroes were like beauties. They were not allowed to see each other until their hair turned white. Oh right, they all said that you are a dragon slayer? Gavara changed the topic. I didn't ask at the time. What happened? Isolated Cliff City was a city where many powerful people gathered. However, Han Jin did not have any magic waves or combat power. Therefore, he gave people a mysterious feeling. No one could figure out his background. If he was a warrior or a magician, the title of Dragon Slayer would have been taken away from him a long time ago. Although Gavara did not know Han Jin's background, he could still tell if he had the ability to kill a giant dragon. Han Jin smiled and told him the whole story. Ha! Gavara laughed in the end. Then, he frowned. That is not a good title. Why? Have you ever heard of someone who dares to call himself a god slayer? Isn't that crazy? Miracles have not appeared for a long time. People still have a strong respect for the gods. The Dragon Realm and Dragon City do exist, Gavara said slowly. If the giant dragons heard that you are a dragon slayer, what do you think they would do? Han Jin was stunned. What would he do? Of course, it was to kill him. If he heard the Evil Eyes bragging about how many people they had killed, he would kill them all the same. I'm not the only dragon knight on the continent. Even if other dragon knights meet you, they won't mind avenging their comrades. Without their help, I would have escaped long ago. Han Jin smiled bitterly. I know you have some amazing magic. You can escape, but what about your friends? If that's the case. Han Jin's face turned cold. I can't do anything for the time being. But I can wait. I have enough time to deal with them. Every time they kill one of my friends, I will make them pay 1,000 times the price in the future. Make the dragons pay 1,000 times the price. Guevara laughed. That's arrogant, but I like it. Han Jin fell into silence again. Although his words were harsh, he still felt uneasy. He was not afraid of the giant dragon, but he was afraid of bringing disaster to his friends. What Guevara said made sense. This title was indeed not a good one. The giant dragons have a long life. If there are no accidents, they can live for thousands of years or even tens of thousands of years. This is common knowledge. Do you know that? Guevara said slowly. Han Jin nodded. You said that you have enough time to deal with them? Han Jin was dumbfounded. It was true that the older you get, the wiser you become. Furthermore, Guevara was a very shrewd person. Guevara immediately found the loophole in his word. Since you don't want to say, I won't ask, Guevara said. However, I have to give you a piece of advice. Becoming a lich is not a good choice. I can assure you that it is absolutely impossible. Han Jin smiled bitterly again. At this time, Winston hurried over. He first bowed to Guevara, then said to Han Jin, Raphael, Hogan suddenly went crazy and killed all the mages from Cold Shadow City. The Mercenary Association restrained him, and he said, This was your order? I told him to do it. Han Jin nodded. Winston sighed in relief. I will immediately negotiate with the Mercenary Association and ask them to release them immediately. The mages from Cold Shadow City? Guevara asked in shock. Yes. How did they leave the snowfield? Cumin City has been annexed and became Cold Shadow City's territory. Sigh. It's getting more and more chaotic. Guevara was stunned for a while, then sighed. I'm guessing that Zagund and Dismark must be very nervous right now. Is Cold Shadow City very powerful? Han Jin asked. When Majordomo Gale heard the news that day, his expression was similar to Guevara's. Very powerful. Guevara pondered for a moment. The Lord of Cold Shadow City, Chesam, is a Thunder Titan. You know what this means, right? The key to this was Chesam. In fact, the previous Lord of Cold Shadow City, Kim, was also a Thunder Titan. However, Kim's personality was peaceful, and he only wanted his people to live a good life. In the 400 years that he was the Lord, Cold Shadow City had never started a war, and had always lived peacefully in the snowfield. However, Chesam is different. He has been the Lord for more than 40 years, and Cold Shadow City and Cumin City have been at war for more than 40 years. If it weren't for the lack of resources in the snowfield, Cumin City would have been destroyed a long time ago. Winston listened carefully and didn't want to leave. He called Saxon over and gave him a few instructions, then stood to the side and listened. Have you seen Chesam? Han Jin asked. I've seen him twice. Guevara thought for a moment. Chesam has a strange personality. You can't judge him with common sense. Sometimes he's very kind. When his sled dog died, he cried in front of his generals and me, his guest. Sometimes he's very cruel. If anyone dares to criticize him, he'll kill them in the palace. Let me tell you something that seems interesting, but after you understand it, you'll feel a chill in your heart. Han Jin and Winston both nodded. He has been the Lord for more than 40 years. Since the first year, he has held more than 100 weddings every year. Is he crazy? Han Jin said, dumbfounded. Listen to me, Guevara said. Guevara said, although the Thunder Titans are shorter than the Titans, Chesam is still more than 3 meters tall. He has a strange fetish. He doesn't like Titan women, saying that they are tasteless. Human women are exactly what he wants. Do you understand? Han Jin didn't say anything for a while. He wasn't a virgin, so of course he understood what Guevara meant. There are rumors in Cold Shadow City that Chesam likes to eat people, especially virgins. They're wrong. Guevara's expression was very strange. Chesam will hold a formal funeral for each of his wives. I flew over the cemetery on my dragon and saw it very clearly. What a huge cemetery! Han Jin and Winston looked at each other. Their expressions were even stranger than Guevara's. I only stayed in Cold Shadow City for a few days. I attended one of his weddings and one of his funerals. He smiled very happily at the wedding, and cried very sadly at the funeral. It wasn't fake. He smiled from the bottom of his heart and cried from the bottom of his heart. It's been more than 40 years. He's always smiling today and crying tomorrow. Guevara paused for a moment and pointed at his head. I think there's something wrong with him here. Of course not. Winston smiled bitterly. If it were me, I wouldn't be able to laugh or cry in a few years. Crazy. Han Jin made a simple comment. But sometimes he's not crazy. For example, when he was negotiating with me. You were negotiating with him? It was a long time ago. Let's not talk about it. Guevara stood up and walked 2 steps before stopping. Raphael, don't ignore my advice. That really isn't a good choice. Han Jin knew that Guevara was still thinking about the Lich incident. He smiled and said, Don't worry, I'm not that stupid. Han Jin was a little touched. The army was destroyed, the city was occupied, and the family was destroyed in the war. Guevara was the only one who survived. A lonely old man was most afraid of not having anything to rely on. Guevara must have placed all his hopes on Han Jin, so he didn't want to see him walk down the wrong path. That was why he repeatedly reminded him. Guevara nodded and slowly walked away. Han Jin and Winston looked at each other. Winston said, It seems that the appearance of Cold Shadow City isn't good news for anyone. Don't think so far ahead. Han Jin smiled. There's still Depew City and Holy Crown City in front of us. Cold Shadow City won't be a threat to us for the time being. Han Jin and Winston chatted for a while. Saxon and Hogan walked in one after another, followed by a few mercenaries who were carrying a few large bags on their back. I won't disturb you. Winston was very tactful. Hogan had followed Han Jin's orders to kill people. There must be something behind it, but it wasn't something he should understand. Winston and Saxon walked towards the gate. The mercenaries put down the bags and left in a hurry. Han Jin looked at the bags and asked, What's this? Sir, before I killed them, I had them take out everything from their spatial rings. Ha. Hogan smiled. Open them. Hogan bent down and opened the bags one by one. They were filled with potion bottles, magic crystals, and all kinds of magic materials. You can come out now, Han Jin said. Following Han Jin's words, a wisp of green smoke floated out of Hogan's mouth and condensed into a skeleton beside Han Jin. He's very obedient? Master, not very obedient, but very, very obedient. Harley laughed sinisterly. Han Jin was silent for a moment. He flicked his wrist, and half of Harley's arm suddenly shot out and hit Hogan. Hogan had time to resist, but he didn't dare to. He didn't even dare to use his magic shield, and was almost knocked over. Harley's teeth chattered nonstop, but as the smoke gathered, half of his arm grew back. Hogan, take off your magic robe and look at your chest. Hogan was stunned, but obediently took off his magic robe and underwear. He saw a skull imprinted on his chest. His expression changed drastically, and he hurriedly looked up at Han Jin. Han Jin flicked his finger, and Hogan's body trembled violently. His eyes were filled with fear. Do you know what to do from now on? Han Jin said lightly. Don't worry, no one else can see it. Only you and I can see it. Master, I can see it too, Harley interrupted. Shut up. Han Jin looked at the magic crystals. Pick out all the 5th grade magic crystals. As for the rest, take whatever you need. Oh right, don't come see me tomorrow. Go see Yelena directly. She's very interested in your alchemy. Yes, Master, Hogan replied in a low voice. Also, how many of the mages in Cold Shadow City have spatial rings? Including Pryo, a total of 3 people have spatial rings. Pryo's spatial ring is in Yelena's hands. Give the other 2 rings to Yelena as well. With that, Han Jin waved his hand. Yes. Hogan bent down and picked out the 5th grade magic crystals. Soon, He picked out the 5th grade magic crystals and took a few more that he needed. Finally, he carefully retreated. Master, what magic did you just release? It's amazing! Harley exclaimed. It's none of your business. But you're extracting my power. Your power? Han Jin said with a faint smile. Is it really your power? Harley didn't dare to say anything else. He was unwilling to admit that it wasn't his power because it was clearly his arm. Even if it was his power, where did it come from? Go, bring me those 5th grade magic crystals. Harley hurriedly floated over and returned to Han Jin's side with more than 20 magic crystals, gently placing them on the table. Han Jin picked up a fire magic crystal and carefully examined it. A faint smile appeared on his face. Master, I feel that you're very happy right now, just for these 5th grade magic crystals? Harley asked curiously. He hadn't spoken for a while, but he couldn't hold it in anymore. Obviously, he was a talkative person when he was alive. I might become a lord. Han Jin smiled. More than a year ago I dreamed of obtaining magic crystals. Countless magic crystals. The red light in Harley's eyes flashed. He couldn't understand. What was the connection between being a lord and magic crystals? Do you know what's the fastest way to accumulate wealth in the world? Doing business. No, doing big business. Wrong, it's plundering. Han Jin sneered. At that time, we wandered around the forest every day and only obtained a dozen magic crystals. I robbed a caravan and in a few days, I obtained hundreds of magic crystals. Rob? Isn't war just robbery? You followed Hogan on a trip and saw those slaves. Do you think they're willing to be slaves? But they're the wealth of the victors. Han Jin waved his hand and kept all the magic crystals into his spatial ring. In front of Guevara, he had to hide himself, but now he had nothing to worry about. Of course, cultivators didn't want to interfere with worldly affairs and only focused on cultivation. The problem was that his cultivation method was different from others. What he urgently needed was the hard currency of the worldly world. Every day, countless people needed it and consumed it. Relying on himself to kill magical beasts to accumulate magic crystals? This idea was ridiculous. When he could absorb the energy of 5th grade magic crystals, he would need 5th grade magic crystals every day. As the saying goes, when he could absorb the energy of 9th grade and 10th grade magic crystals, where would he find so many high-level magic beasts to kill? Even if his luck was ridiculously good, he would eat a magic crystal for every magical beast he killed. What about his companions? Would they risk their lives to help him? Moreover, Han Jin wasn't a cultivator who started cultivating from a young age. Not only did he have enough understanding of the worldly world, but he had also lived in it. In reality, the rich weren't farmers or factory workers. In the unreal world, the rich weren't players who worked hard to kill monsters every day. To put it bluntly, the people who created surplus value would always live at the bottom. At most, they would have enough to eat and wear. In the beginning, Han Jin wanted to hunt magical beasts and save up a certain amount of capital to slowly build up his business. But after being bullied for no reason, time and time again, he completely realized that this world where magic and Do Chi flourished but civilization wasn't developed was far crueler than he imagined. There was only one way for him to move forward without hindrance at every stage, and that was to control a powerful national machine and rely on it to satisfy all his needs. Bismarck of the Holy Crown City just sat there and didn't do anything. His daily income was at least equivalent to a few 10th grade magic crystals, right? If he defeated Zagund, how much could he earn? Chaesam of the Cold Shadow City took over the Common City. The thousands of slaves in the city could be seen, but how many could not be seen? And these were just slaves. Cultivating peacefully was too slow. Han Jin had this thought in the past, but he didn't dare to think too much about it, nor did he have the right to think about it. But today, Han Jin's words ignited his ambition like a prairie fire. Harley saw Han Jin's expression change and didn't dare to say anything more. He just stared blankly at Han Jin. After a long while, Han Jin took out the soul-devouring orb from his space ring. You can go back now. Master, can I learn your magic? Harley braced himself and asked. If only he had the courage. Han Jin suddenly turned his gaze and looked at Harley. Harley was so scared that he couldn't speak coherently. Master, I was just joking with you, hee hee. I was going to promise you, but I didn't expect you to be joking with me. Forget it then. No, master. Harley panicked as soon as he heard this. He cursed himself for being such a coward. Master, I really want to learn. Harley yelled as he nodded vigorously. Fortunately, he was now made of smoke, so he wasn't afraid of losing his head. One moment you want to learn, the next moment you don't want to learn. Are you making fun of me? No. Harley was tongue-tied, but he immediately noticed that the corner of Han Jin's mouth was slightly raised, and his eyes were full of laughter. Master, you're the one making fun of me. Go back first, Han Jin chuckled. When it's time to teach you, I'll naturally teach you. Harley floated towards the soul-devouring orb. His movements weren't fast, but when his hand touched the soul-devouring orb, the orb seemed to have a huge attractive force. With a whoosh, the smoke was instantly pulled into a straight line. The next moment, Harley was already back inside the soul-devouring orb. Chapter 218. It's right in front. Hayden put his arm around Charles's shoulder affectionately. Hayden, next time something like this happens, don't drag me along, okay? Charles said with a bitter smile. Then who do you think I should find? Drag Gibran with me to pick up girls? Julia is going to kill me. Kane? He's very busy. He's been researching the alchemy of Cold Shadow City with Yelena and Cessation for the past few days. Hayden chuckled. Besides, I've taken care of you this time. Taken care of me? When have you ever taken care of me? Hayden made a mysterious face. That girl has an older sister. TSK, her face is so beautiful. Even Julia and Edwina can't compare. Don't compare them to Julia and Edwina, Charles said with some displeasure. Look at your temper. Hayden pouted. Let's make a deal. I'll continue to pick up that girl, and I'll leave her sister to you. Acting all serious now, hee. When you see her, you might be even more anxious than I am. I'm not interested. Charles shook his head. We'll see if you're interested when you see her. If you're not, I'll come back with you, okay? Hayden looked up. We're here. It's that courtyard. After a few steps, Hayden yelled, I'm here. Then, he pushed the door open and walked in. The door was pushed open. The woman whom Charles had seen last time was standing at the door with a smile. As soon as she saw Hayden, the two of them couldn't wait to hug each other. Charles could even clearly see Hayden's hands touching everywhere. Not only was the woman not angry, but she even let out a sweet and coquettish laugh. What a slut! Charles commented in his heart. At this moment, he had no interest in getting to know the woman's sister. Birds of a feather flock together. With a sister like that, the sister couldn't be much better. I won't go in. I'll wait for you outside, Charles called out. Come in. Hayden turned around and said with dissatisfaction. Aren't you ruining my mood? Charles hesitated for a moment. After all, he and Hayden were comrades who had gone through thick and thin together. He didn't want to hurt their relationship over such a small matter. After thinking for a moment, he reluctantly walked into the courtyard. Walking into the main room, Charles saw a woman sitting on a chair. Judging from her appearance, this elder sister was indeed stronger than her younger sister, but her eyes were murderous and her aura was awe-inspiring. That was a kind of power that could only be cultivated by being in a high position for a long time. Was this kind of woman someone could casually play with? Charles was taken aback. At this moment, a soft sound came from behind him. Then, Charles felt a chill at the back of his waist. Something cold pierced through his waist, and a gleaming sword tip came out from his lower abdomen. Blood spurted out. Having been on the verge of death for a long time, Charles's reaction speed was extremely fast. He immediately made a judgment. There was an enemy and he was heavily injured. He was afraid that he would not make it. He grabbed the tip of the sword tightly and rushed forward a few steps. He turned around and opened his mouth to shout, but his entire body was stunned. Charles wanted Hayden to escape quickly. It was better if one of the brothers could escape. He didn't want both of them to die here. Who knew that when he turned around, he would realize that it was Hayden who was attacking him. You, Hayden! Charles's eyes were about to pop out of their sockets as he roared. A figure flashed, and a white hand brushed past Charles's neck. His head flew off his neck and spun a few times in the air, leaving behind a curtain of bright red blood. Finally, it fell to the ground. His eyes were still wide open, and the anger in them was still clearly visible. Hayden, I asked you to trick Sunir into coming out. Why did you find me such a piece of trash? The beautiful woman who attacked coldly said. My lord, I went to find Sunir and asked her to go shopping with me? Would I still be able to come out then? Hayden smiled bitterly. His eyes were drifting, but he didn't dare to look at Charles. Sister Caroline, I think what he said makes sense. The woman who was sitting there motionlessly revealed a faint smile. Asking him to ask Sunir out is a stupid plan in itself. You. Caroline suddenly turned around and glared at the woman. Betty, are you here to help me or to cause trouble for me? Ah. Sister Caroline, you came up with this plan? I thought it was that idiot Jocelyn. Betty showed a modest expression. Sister Caroline, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. Jocelyn, who was leaning against Hayden, looked very upset, but she didn't dare to say anything. Both of them were matriarchs, and she couldn't afford to offend either of them. Humph. Caroline suddenly turned around and looked at Hayden coldly. She couldn't lose her temper at Betty, so she could only pour her anger on Hayden. Even if you can't ask Sunir out, there's still Morrison's and Sassu, any of them can do it. Why did you find me an unrelated person? Caroline was extremely angry. If it weren't for the fact that Hayden was still useful, she would have killed him long ago. She thought that she would be able to taste the joy of revenge today, but who knew that an unrelated person would come, which made her very disappointed. My lady, Sassu is now focused on studying alchemy in Cold Shadow City, so he won't come out at all. Morrison's. That guy has a good relationship with me, but he wants to compete with me in swordsmanship. I can't fight with him, or else I'll be exposed. I can't wait to avoid him. Hayden smiled bitterly. Betty suddenly interrupted. Will Raphael care about this dead man? You mean, Charles? A trace of pain flashed through Hayden's eyes. He will. As long as Gibran is in a hurry, Raphael will definitely help him. Then you can go back, Betty said. Hayden's hand involuntarily tightened around Jocelyn's waist. He was reluctant to leave. Scram! Betty's expression suddenly changed. Hayden was shocked. He didn't dare to say anything else and obediently left. After Hayden left the room, Betty calmly said, Sister Caroline, don't blame me for not reminding you. An incomplete blood thrall can't be trusted. Just now, he didn't dare to look at his companion's body because he felt guilty. If he had completely become a blood thrall, would he still be able to hide from so many people? It's up to you. I'm just here to cooperate with you. Betty smiled. But, Sister Caroline, as wives, we should always remember our husband's words. You haven't done enough in this regard. Betty, what do you mean? Caroline said coldly. He said that no matter what you do, you should use your strengths to deal with your enemy's weaknesses. Your strength isn't in making plans, but in fighting, Betty said softly. If it were me, I would have gone to him a long time ago. Okay, go ahead. I won't stop you, Caroline said with a contemptuous smile. Jocelyn couldn't help but feel anxious. No matter which of the two ladies got into trouble, she wouldn't have a good ending when she returned. She was worried that Betty wouldn't be able to take the provocation and really go to them. She timidly interrupted, "Second madam, you just arrived and don't know the situation yet. Guevara is here with Raphael and the others." "Guevara?" Betty's expression immediately changed. "Which, Guevara? Are there many people named Guevara?" Caroline sneered. "It's the Guevara who made you scream and almost wet your skirt." "You!" Betty's face turned red. She couldn't maintain her composure anymore. She suddenly stood up. "Caroline, how are you any better? Who was the one who desperately screamed, 'Save me'?" The two fiercely stared at each other. Suddenly, they recalled the nightmarish scene. Guevara wanted to sneak into Black Raven City to assassinate Sigund. But in fact, it was not an assassination, but a battle. A one-man battle. Most of the residents of Black Raven City were from the abyssal race. Humans were generally low-status slaves. Therefore, Guevara was discovered as soon as he entered the city. He fought back and forth alone with a war spear. He bathed the streets in blood and killed Sigund's army. Coincidentally, the two of them were about to go out with Sigund when they bumped into Guevara, who had just raised his butcher's knife. The dangerous scene at that time was still pressing on their hearts like a dark cloud. "Why don't you go?" Caroline said in a mocking tone. "I'm not going. It's not my son who died anyway." Betty suddenly became quiet. "You!" Caroline was so angry that her entire body started to tremble. She couldn't help but take a step forward. Calm down, calm down. Your son is dead, but my son is still alive." "Sister Caroline, in the future," Betty said calmly, "you have a lot of things to ask of me. You have to keep an eye on that trash. Be careful not to be eaten by wild dogs one day." Caroline said fiercely. Vampires were born with strong combat power. No matter how useless they would not be eaten by wild dogs. The so-called wild dogs, of course, implied that the bodies were left in the wilderness. Betty knew what this meant. A murderous intent flashed in her eyes. She then raised her head and said in a gentle tone, "It's my fault, Sister Caroline. I've been fighting with you for decades. It's become a habit. Haha. I can't help but quarrel when I see you. You're the elder sister, so of course you have to give in to me." "Humph," Caroline snorted. However, her expression seemed to have eased up slightly. "Actually, we don't have to be afraid of Guevara. He has been tortured by us for so many years that even his body has begun to shrink. I don't believe that he can still maintain the strength of a peak level 12. Betty paused and sighed. "We should have killed him earlier." Caroline was silent. Speaking of this matter, all three of them were at fault. At that time, the scouts found a secret in the depths of the underground city. They were in a hurry to get there and received news that the Beatman's Riptide was attacking Black Raven City. Sigund hurriedly gave a few orders and they set off. When they realized that they had missed Guevara, it was already too late. "When did Guevara arrive?" Betty asked. "Second madam, 1 day earlier than you." "Then you." Betty was stunned. "Second madam, Raphael has an extremely strong fighter with him. The first madam said that he might be the dark left hand of the elemental capital." "Gale." Betty was stunned for a long time. She smiled bitterly and said, "Is that Raphael a treasure? Why are there so many strong fighters around him?" You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.